Hey there everyone, Doggin Days here, and after a long hiatus, we're finally returning to our tier list / unit power analysis series, where we do in-depth looks into the official units of Classic Heroscape. Today, we'll be covering all of the units released in Classic Heroscape's Wave 2 expansion, Utgar's Rage. This is one of the most enduringly impactful expansion waves of the game, with many of the units introduced in it still having a significant presence in the competitive landscape. While I'll give each of the units in this wave the best treatment I can, there's no hiding the fact that many of these units are going to rank very highly on any tier list or power rankings they're sorted into. Regarding rankings, I'd be remiss if I jumped into things without first sharing the fact that power rankings have existed for Heroscape's units for many, many years, and are maintained by far better players than I with far more experience in competitive play. In the most up-to-date community power rankings found on heroscape.org, you can see that there are 11 possible rankings a unit can be sorted into, with A+ being the highest and F being the lowest. Our tier list videos here only have 7 rankings, S being the highest and F being the lowest. As such, the community power rankings, in addition to having far more gameplay experience and data put into them, capture more nuance within different levels of unit strength. The community rankings also include rankings for 4 different formats: Classic, VC Classic, Delta, and VC Delta. For those unfamiliar, Classic simply refers to the original points assigned to a unit on their card at the time of release, without any changes. Delta, by contrast, is a community project that reassigns point values on all units across Heroscape to better match their power levels. Traditionally strong units get points increases, and traditionally weak units get points discounts. And VC refers to Valhalla Customs, another community project in which community members and unofficial design teams rigorously playtest and approve custom units to be added into the game. VC units are, on the whole, exceptionally well designed and balanced, and are broadly accepted at most unofficial events. More than that, they're just a blast to play with, and add layers of rich complexity to the game. Together with Delta points, VC produces what I believe to be the best of the 4 formats, VC Delta. I began this series before I discovered VC Delta, and so the first 2 episodes in this series only concern themselves with the official unit roster at Classic points. We'll continue that tradition in this video, but we'll also be supporting it with some additional coverage of VC and Delta pricing. That's because different power rankings exist for official units within Classic, VC Classic, Delta, and VC Delta, sometimes varying quite a bit by format. So not only will I be giving my own ranking of Wave 2's units on our fun little tier list, but I'll also be including a section for each unit that goes over Delta pricing and the different community rankings within the different formats. That way, I hope to give you all a clearer picture of what the community consensus is on these units to augment my own thoughts. I've only been playing competitive Heroscape for just under 2 years at the time of this video, and though I've played Heroscape casually with friends ever since it released, I've only recently engaged with the broader community in those past 2 years. So I definitely still feel like the new kid on the block, and the imposter syndrome is real anytime I analyze units with an eye for competitive play. Know that I don't view our tier list series here as hard and fast rankings of the units in each wave we explore. Rather, I view them as a series of thought pieces that are part nostalgic retrospective, part genuine strategic analysis, and part miscellaneous personal views on the units we cover. The tier list format is just a helpful way for me to organize my thoughts. And finally, while I never discuss a unit in this series until I've played a few games with it, there are inevitably gaps in my knowledge and competitive experience. Know that what I say in this video and series are just my thoughts on these units, and I encourage anyone who thinks I've misunderstood a unit or got anything factually wrong to let me know in the comments. I may not respond to every comment on my videos, but I do read them all. And with that, once again, I've kept you all waiting through far too long an intro. As always, I'll have some resources in the video description and closing thoughts at the end of the video, but we have a heck of a lot of Scape talk to do before that. And so, sit back, relax, and join me as we embark on our deep dive into the much beloved units of Wave 2, Utgar's Rage. First up, we come to the 4th Massachusetts line, the first and only 4-figure ranged common squad of the Jandar faction in official Heroscape. Veterans of the American Revolution back on Earth, the 4th Massachusetts line fought under General George Washington against the forces of the British Empire before being summoned to Valhalla by General Jandar. In a triumphant twist, when the 4th Mass met with Sergeant Drake Alexander, who was summoned to Valhalla prior to their arrival, the Patriot soldiers discovered that the revolution they'd fought for had been a success, and had founded a nation that lasted long into the 20th century back on Earth. The 4th Mass now fight in Jandar's armies for the Wellsprings of Valhalla with the same valor and determination they demonstrated against the British in the 13 colonies on Earth. The 4th Mass are a great example of how the sophistication of a particular warrior's equipment and weapons by real-world standards doesn't always correlate with how well that warrior will perform in the battle of all time. Though Heroscape is rich with units possessing technologically advanced hardware or devastatingly powerful magics in the lore, all that truly matters when playing is how well the powers and stats of a unit's card translate into the mechanics of the game. And even with their antiquated muskets and colonial-era uniforms and gear, the 4th Mass are nevertheless one of the most consistently effective units on the board. On paper, the 4th Mass display pretty average stats for a ranged squad. 5 move is average across all of official Heroscape, and 6 range is average for ranged figures. Among common ranged units, 2 is the average for both attack and defense. But we can already see one area in which the 4th Mass are above average, their number of figures. At 4 figures per squad, the 4th Mass beat out most official squads, range or melee, in figure count, with 3 being the average squad size. This becomes even more impressive when we factor in their powers. However average their base stats look at first glance, the 4th Mass's 2 powers give them easy ways to buff their attack and defense to 3. Wait Then Fire allows all 4th Mass attacking on a turn to increase their attack value by 1, so long as none of them have moved during the turn. And Valiant Army Defense bonus gives all 4th Mass in an army +1 to their defense if all other figures in that army are of the Valiant personality. Let's start our look into their powers by digging into the Valiant Army bonus, as most serious players running the 4th Mass are going to design their armies to get this buff. I say most, because there was discussion around the time of the 4th Mass's release that argued in favor of 4th Mass armies that weren't completely Valiant to give them access to non-Valiant support units. For example, the 4th Mass as soldier class figures can receive the movement and attack buffs of Marcus Decimus Gallus. This would certainly improve their mobility and offense, but it would also prevent them from getting their Valiant Army defense, since Marcus is of the disciplined personality. Nowadays, players wanting to run Marcus, or other non-Valiant units in their army, have the 10th Regiment of Foot, a unit that is very similar to the 4th Mass that doesn't have any personality-dependent powers. So for our purposes here, I'm generally assuming that if someone has chosen the 4th Mass over the 10th Reg, they're doing so to get the Valiant Army defense buff. As they should, because this is an impressive bonus. Many attack or defense buffs in Heroscape are conditional upon a unit's location on the board. Are they on height? Are they on a shadow space or next to a jungle piece? Or are they within a support unit's buff range, such as adjacent to the Viking champions Finn or Thorgrim, or within the aura buffs of Kyrie warriors Raylin or Taylord? And if glyphs are present with attack or defense buffs, are any of your figures standing on those glyphs to control them and grant your army their buffs? But Valiant Army Defense bonus has none of these location concerns. Once the 4th Mass are drafted into an all-Valiant army, they will receive their defense buff for the entire game, no matter where they are on the map. This means their defense immediately goes from average to above average among common range squads in Heroscape, regardless of where they travel on the board. And 4-figure squads can travel a lot. In addition to the increased number of attacks, 4-figure squads give players lots of development flexibility. If turn 1 is spent developing 4 figures, then on turn 2, a player can further advance those 4 developed figures, or they could move up another set of 4 from their start zone, or do a combination of both by advancing 1 or 2 frontline troops, while also developing a few from their start zone in the same turn. Because Valiant Army Defense lasts as long as a single 4th Mass is still alive, a player has the freedom to spread his 4th Mass out across the board during the development phase without fear of losing that buff. And after a couple turns of development, a few squads of 4th Mass with their range can control and threaten whole regions of the map. That prospect becomes even more impressive when we factor in their attack buffing power, Wait Then Fire. Even if a 4th Mass doesn't have height on their target, so long as no 4th Mass move that turn, that soldier can raise his attack to 3. This is above average attack for both common and unique ranged squads. And just like the Valiant Army bonus, it's not location conditional. The 4th Mass can be anywhere on the board and still get that buff, so long as they stay put that turn. There are many other ranged units in Heroscape that need to group together into pods, usually on height, where they will be nearby a supporting unit in order to raise their attacks. Once established, these group formations usually want to camp, as a lot of effort and order markers likely would have gone into setting up those positions in the first place, and moving would undo that work. But the 4th Mass don't need to set up pods to put out strong ranged attacks. If they can develop themselves onto height, then they can put out 4 attacks of 3 on a turn they moved. and then next turn, if Wait Then Fire triggers, an entire squad of 4th Mass is dropping 4 attacks of 4 in a single turn at 6 range. When you consider that this is coming from a squad that only costs 70 points without any help from support units, that is remarkable ranged output. It should be said that Renegade has announced price increases for certain highly ranked official units for their competitive events, with 4th Mass being one of the units affected. We'll come to that adjustment later, but for now, I want to look at what the Minutemen were priced at for most of their presence in the game. A good comparison unit to the 4th Mass is the Marro Stingers, 10 points cheaper than the 4th Mass's original price. The Stingers are a ranged common squad that have the 4th Mass beat on base attack and defense at 3-3 respectively, compared to the 4th Mass's 2-2. But the Stingers are only 3 figures to a squad, and have 1 less range than the 4th Mass at only 5 range. It's true that the Stingers have a chance to increase their attack to 4 with Stinger Drain, but that's based on d20 rolls, and the Stingers pay a high price if they roll poorly in that one of their own must be destroyed. While the Stingers are a well-regarded unit in their own right, I think it's interesting that for 10 points more in the old points, a player could draft a squad that doesn't have to work very hard to achieve 3-3 attack defense on its own, all with 1 extra point in range and an extra figure per squad. One area the Stingers, and nearly every other unit in the game, compare favorably to the 4th Mass in, is in their options for army compositions. While the 4th Mass are strong, I don't think they're always earning their points unless they're getting their Valiant Army defense bonus, so players running them will often restrict their armies to Valiant personality units. Stingers, on the other hand, and the vast majority of other official units, can build their armies however they please regardless of personality. One might say this is an important check on a unit as strong as the 4th Mass, keeping them from partnering with other excellent units like Old Raylin or Major Q9. But this isn't that big a handicap when you look at all the other Valiant units available in official Heroscape. Valiant players have high attack options via all versions of Sergeant Drake Alexander and Alistair McDurk, 2 highly durable melee squads in the Knights of Weston and Sentinels of Jandar, all 3 Viking champions who provide stat buffs after they die, and even a dragon, Charos. Valiant players even have 2 Marvel hero options via Captain America and Silver Surfer, arguably the 2 strongest units in the Marvel Master Set. That means a player could bring the 4th Mass to a Marvel event and still have a very strong build with very strong heroes in tow. So if a 4th Mass player complains about lack of options, you can be forgiven for not shedding any tears. When designing a 4th Mass army around the Valiant personality, I don't think they need a whole lot else to round them out. Depending on matchups, you may want to follow the usual advice of including a common melee squad for a screen. In that case, Valiant players have one of the finest melee squads in Heroscape, the Knights of Weston, 2 squads of which could screen a large area in front of the 4th Mass and really lock down attackers with their Coward's Reward power. The Knights can also bond with several strong Valiant human champions, which a 4th Mass player may wish to draft to give them extra tools into more matchups. The Sentinels of Jandar can also fill the screening role reasonably well, being very hard to kill with Shields of Valor, though they are more expensive and have fewer figures per squad, so they'll inevitably control less area on a map. But I don't think you need to screen for the 4th Mass in every matchup. Sometimes 4 or 5 squads of Minutemen with Drake, Alistair, or even Charos will cover most of your bases in a game. If a player is going all in on 4th Mass as their core common squad, then they'll likely incur some early losses to enemy ranged fire as they develop in the early game. But 4 squads of 4th Mass is 16 figures, so they can afford to lose a few as they set themselves up on height. I do think it's worth spending as many turns as needed to set as many 4th Mass onto height as possible, accepting what losses that come on their way there. You want to get your movement phase over with early, such that your Minutemen are in positions where they can hunker down on height and start wait then firing into their enemies. Because once most or all of your 4th Mass are in such positions, they'll swing the game around and punish your opponent for any early losses they incurred. They're surprisingly resilient with their height and Valiant buffed 4 defense, and are probably doing at least a few wounds of damage each turn with 4 attacks of 4. By that point in the game, they've also likely advanced far enough out onto the board that almost nowhere is safe from at least one of their 4 ranged attacks per turn, and this means they have options. Are the 4th Mass about to get swarmed by commons? Have them target 4 different figures. Is a dangerous hero approaching? Have all 4 throw 16 dice at that hero in one turn, or mix and match as the battle demands. That's really why the 4th Mass are so good. They're flexible and reliable. You don't have to work too hard, or think too hard, to play them well. When a 4-figure squad can buff itself to 3-3 attack defense at 6 range for only 70 points, you don't need much imagination to make them work in most matchups. That's why they're A tier. They stay just below S tier because there are notable counters to them, such as range-resistant squads like the Krav Maga agents and Phantom Knights, as well as the Death Reavers, who are more than happy to take 4 shots per turn with their scatter power. The 4th mass can also be outranged by certain squads and many strong heroes, such as Savaris. Zelrig can also waste them early in a game before they've spread out, with his 7-range explosion attack. These and similar long-range units are good at forcing the Minutemen to move to chase their attackers down, which will remove their weight and fire bonuses and may pull them off of height in pursuit. But you know a unit's good when all of its counters are already very strong units in their own right. When a player anticipates going up against the 4th mass, they're probably building as strong an army as they can. That means more meta units are showing up all around, which I think is boring. In fact, because of how straightforwardly excellent they are, I think the 4th mass are one of the most boring units in the official roster. The Heroscape player in me sighs every time I see them on the board. However, the American in me delights in knowing that one of Heroscape's best units is a squad of Revolutionary War patriots who are as strong and relevant today as they were when they were first released in 2005. And as mentioned, before moving on to the next unit on our list, we'll take a moment to cover where the 4th mass stand in the power rankings that can be found on heroscape.org. As of this video, we can see the Minutemen are A-ranked across all 4 formats, so the inclusion of the VC roster doesn't seem to alter their strength that much. If anything, VC just gives them more options for building Valiant armies, since it adds a nice collection of Valiant units to the game. We see too that Delta pricing has them up a significant 45 points for a final 115 points per squad. That's the case in both Delta and VC Delta. We should point out that Delta pricing is updated every so often to reflect changes in the ever-evolving competitive meta. So 115 is where the 4th mass stand at the time of this video, but that may well change. It seems these guys have been going up in price with each new Delta update.
Which is fine by me.
And it seems Renegade agrees, as they've also increased pricing on the 4th mass for their events by 30 points. That makes for a final Renegade price of 100 points per squad. No matter who's hosting and no matter what event type, most everyone agrees the Minutemen are way too strong for only 70 points. Moving on from real-world historical units, we come to the realm of fantasy with our next unit, the Anubian Wolves. These ferocious upright-standing wolfmen hail from the planet Feylund, where they were engaged in a conflict with Feylund's elf race before being summoned to Valhalla by General Utgar. It's unclear in the lore what the origins of the Anubians are as a race. Looking at them for the first time, one might imagine they were once members of another humanoid race transformed into werewolves through some magic or lycanthropy. It's also possible they are a unique race unto themselves, with merely the appearance of werewolves. Whether true werewolves or not, the Anubians bring to bear against Utgar's enemies the trademark bloodthirst of the fantasy trope from which they draw inspiration. As werewolf-like beings, the Anubians have an appropriately swift move of 6. They're a melee squad with range of 1 and boast an above-average defense of 4. I always thought this 4 defense was a nice point in the Anubians' favor. It struck me as a unit the designers could easily have put at 3 defense, given the actual size of the figures on the board. But I'm glad they didn't, especially at a 75-point price tag per squad. Less impressive is the Wolves' paltry base attack of 1, but anyone who's played them knows that 1 is rarely ever their true attack value. And that's all due to Unleashed Fury, the main reason to draft the Anubians into an army. Unleashed Fury is similar to the wild pack movement power of the Marden Hounds, in that it's a mandatory stat modifier a player must roll the d20 to determine the effect of before starting the Wolves' movement phase. Where the Hounds have to roll the d20 to determine what their move stat in a turn will be, Unleashed Fury determines what the Wolves' attack stat on a turn will be. A roll of 2 through 6 adds 1 to their base attack, 7 through 11 adds 2, 12 through 15 adds 3, 16 through 19 adds 4, and 20 adds a staggering 8. And if a player is unlucky enough to roll a 1, the Wolves' base attack stays at 1, and that player must destroy one of their Wolves. With these parameters, and the fact that Unleashed Fury is a mandatory roll, it's clear that a player running the Wolves is especially at the d20's mercy compared to most other armies. But for players fielding the Anubians and players fighting against them, knowing the likelihood of each Unleashed Fury outcome can help set expectations ahead of a turn on the Wolves. There are 2 ways of approaching probabilities on the outcome of rolling for Unleashed Fury: calculating probabilities of the Anubians in isolation, and calculating with the d20 buff of Khosumet the Darklord. As a hero released in Wave 2, we'll cover Khosumet in greater depth later in this video. But any analysis of the Anubians is incomplete without covering his Unleashed Fury enhancement buff in some detail here. Like similar enhancement powers on hero figures, Khosumet's enhancement buffs any d20 roll for any Unleashed Fury power by 1. With the Anubians by themselves, there's a 5% chance the wolves will stay at base 1 attack, and in that scenario, they will also be forced to destroy one of their own. From there, there's a 25% chance their attack becomes 2, a 25% chance it becomes 3, a 20% chance it becomes 4, a 20% chance it becomes 5, and a 5% chance it becomes 9. Taken together, these odds produce an average expected attack strength of 3.55, which is respectable given that 3 attack is roughly average for melee squads in Heroscape. And we can see there's a solid 70% likelihood the Anubians will achieve at least 3 base attack with Unleashed Fury alone. But when a unit's attack stat jumps from 3 to 4, it suddenly poses a real threat of breaking through high-level defense stats, and the Anubians will achieve 4 attack or more on 45% of their d20 rolls. Now let's rerun those probabilities with Khosumet, or any +1 buff to d20 rolls. The chance of the wolves getting stuck at base 1 attack now evaporates, as does the chance a player will have to destroy one of their wolves on a roll. The remaining attack tiers will retain the same probabilities as without Khosumet, except for the highest attack tier. That tier, the chance of 9 attack, now jumps from 5 to 10%. Khosumet's buff also increases the overall average expected attack value of Unleashed Fury from 3.55 to 3.95. Looking at it another way, with Khosumet, the wolves achieve at least 3 attack 75% of the time, and at least 4 attack 50% of the time. While Khosumet is undoubtedly a help to his wolves, the only thing he guarantees is that the wolves won't self-destruct while he's alive. The fact is, with or without their Darklord, the wolves will always be at the whims of the d20 when determining their attack strength. But a wise player can play into, rather than against, that uncertainty. One way to look at the Anubian Wolves is as a unit whose role in an army is subject to change every turn based on the d20. Usually, when Unleashed Fury rolls are poor or average, their job is that of basic grunt infantry, only strong enough to take on lower-level squad figures. But sometimes, when rolls are high, they are suddenly promoted to hero-killing assassins who should be sent to strike any high-value targets nearby. Since there's no way to foresee when such rolls will occur, a player should try to position themselves to capitalize on strong Fury rolls if and when they arise, even while the wolves are just doing grunt work. To that end, it's often a good idea to keep the wolves within striking distance of a few different types of targets if possible. If both a lowly squad figure and a powerful hero, like a major or a dragon, are within a single Anubian's threat range at the end of their turn, then on the wolves' next turn, you can select your target based on the outcome of that turn's Fury roll. And with their threat range of 7, they should have plenty of options for targets, or short of that, options for where to move to set up target options next turn. For most common squad cores in Heroscape, I found it's generally good to maintain a healthy balance of attacking with frontline figures already developed, and continually developing a few backup figures from the start zone to quickly replenish frontline losses. But that requires a player's judgment on when to push with their developed figures, or when to hang back and reinforce with support from the rear. Unleashed Fury for the wolves, however, can be a way to offload some of that decision-making onto the d20. If a Fury roll isn't strong and your frontline isn't in immediate danger, that can be a good time to spend your turn developing a full squad of wolves from out of the start zone, and foregoing your attack phase on a turn, since none of the wolves would be hitting hard that turn anyway. This has the bonus of setting up a larger number of wolves with more attack options as your frontline converges with the opponents. However, if a Fury roll is suddenly strong and you have 3 frontline wolves within striking distance of valuable targets, pushing further with all 3 is a no-brainer, even when that means sacrificing rear development. This is especially true if you get lucky and roll a 20 or 19 with Khosumet. When the wolves achieve 9 attack with Unleashed Fury, a host of risky plays suddenly justify themselves due to how unlikely it is one would ever get an opportunity to drop that much attack again in a game. For example, if the wolves charge up to 9 attack on a turn, and there's a priority target that only one wolf can reach, that wolf should drop what it's doing and go for that target. And that sometimes means risking disengaging with that wolf and or exposing it to passing swipes. Long before I started this channel, I read for the first time the Unit Strategy Review article on the Anubian Wolves, written by Jexic on the Heroscapers forums. In that piece, Jexic made exactly this point on disengaging with the wolves. If all your wolves are engaged with lesser enemy units, but charge up to 9 attack with Unleashed Fury, then you should disengage with some or all of them to use their attack against higher value units. And I remember resisting that point in my mind for a year or two after first reading it. Should you really risk a 25-point figure so frivolously, I thought, especially when that wolf is already engaged with a target they could drop their 9 attack on without risking any wounds? But I eventually came around to Jexic's argument. Disengagements really aren't the boogeymen they sometimes seem to be. The whole point of disengaging is to take a risk in hopes of obtaining a better position on the board, or securing a better attack opportunity you didn't have while engaged. Sometimes the disengage gamble fails, but when it succeeds, a single successful disengagement and repositioning often make your game environment a lot more favorable to you. And I can think of few better times to take such a risk than when the wolves are at 9 attack. A single disengagement, unless from a figure with Coward's Reward, has a 50% chance of dealing a wound to a wolf. But as we've seen, a wolf only has a 5% chance of hitting 9 attack, 10% with Khosumet. So in either case, it's still worth the risk if you get extremely lucky with your Fury roll. But this all returns us to how variable and unreliable the wolves are in general. When drafting the wolves, you're accepting that the D20 will rule over your game as long as you're activating them, and it is a capricious tyrant. I've played games with the wolves where they charge up to 9 attack on their first turn when they have no one nearby to strike, and I've had mid-game turns where the wolves are surrounded by or engaged with mobs of valuable enemy targets, but they refuse to charge up beyond 2 attack. Sometimes, the wolves will stubbornly stay at 2 or 3 attack across an entire game, barely making a dent in the enemy. Other times, they might get that 20, and earn a turn where they're serving up 3 attacks of 9 to the opponent. I've been dwelling a lot on the long-shot possibility of the wolves rolling 9 attack, partly because it's the most dramatic result of Unleashed Fury, with the most dramatic change to a player's incentive and risk assessments. But similar considerations come into play if the wolves achieve a strong 5 attack with Unleashed Fury, an attack strength still powerful enough to inflict a few wounds on a hero, which then still warrants the occasional disengagement in pursuit of such opportunities. And of course, without Khosumet, there's always a chance the wolves are stuck at 1 base attack. In that scenario, it's almost always best to develop wolves that don't have any chance of engaging a target, then hoping already developed wolves will survive into the next turn to try one's luck again with Unleashed Fury. Fortunately, the wolves with their 4 defense do stand a decent chance of withstanding most average strength attacks, so that at least a few in the front line last into their next turn. There's one unit that the Anubians deserve comparison to, and that's the Marro Stingers again, with their Stinger Drain power. While a Stinger player doesn't have to roll for Stinger Drain, if they do, they also run a 20% chance of having to self-destruct a Stinger. If they roll poorly enough that this happens, that player is also barred from attacking with any of their Stingers on that turn. Unleashed Fury, though a mandatory roll, has a lesser likelihood of destroying a wolf at only 5%. And even if this happens, a player can still move and attack with a full squad of wolves, which is a nice consolation for so chance-dependent a unit. In summary, though the wolves always pose a threat with their extremely high attack potential, their high variability makes them tough for me to rank any higher or lower than C tier. Unleashed Fury means they can seriously impress, or seriously disappoint, anyone running them. They can also be perfectly average across a game, or fluctuate wildly between all 3 possibilities. That unpredictability means you have to be ready to adapt your game as your fortunes change, which doesn't always lend itself to competitive environments where consistency is favored. But consistency is boring. The Anubians are one of my favorite units to play in Heroscape because every turn with them starts off with excitement. The constant anticipation of getting a powerful Unleashed Fury roll at just the right time keeps me and my opponents on our toes, and if and when that 20 roll happens, it's like cocaine. Not that I would know anything about that. You might be losing with the wolves, then out of nowhere, they show up and take out a major in 1 turn. That's fun. Less fun is when the wolves rarely rise above 2 attack in a game. But in all likelihood, a player can go into a game with reasonable confidence that the wolves will average 3 to 4 attack, and that can do enough work to earn their points. In official Heroscape, 75 points is just slightly over average cost for common squad units, and that seems to fit the wolves' niche in the game well. They have solid stats outside of their variable attack, and there are a few units, like Khosumet or the Diminutive Guard, who offer the wolves adjacency attack buffs on top of whatever Unleashed Fury buffs them to. But those are usually situational bonuses rather than synergies to build your entire army around. The fact is, the wolves by themselves can be a reasonably effective core squad without any synergies. The chances that they fail to rise above 2 attack, and that they can self-destruct, are drawbacks to drafting them, and keep them just shy of B tier on this list. But the possibility that they might get 1 or more turns to throw 27 attack dice at an opponent mean they will always be one of the most dangerous and exciting squads in the game. Moving to the community rankings for the Anubians, we can see they're ranked B- across the board, and both Delta and VC Delta have them discounted by 10 points, which makes sense with their attack inconsistency. On the one hand, it does break my heart a little to see them considered poor enough in the game that they need a discount. On the other hand, that discount's pretty minimal, and just makes them easier to field. So I'm counting that as a win. And wouldn't you know it, the next Wave 2 unit in alphabetical order on our list is none other than Khosumet the Darklord himself, one of the most esteemed warriors among the Anubians of Feylund. On their home planet, Khosumet led his fellow wolves in their campaigns against the elves of Feylund prior to his recruitment by Utgar. It's said that Khosumet was engaged in a clash with the elf wizard Chargris at the time of his summoning. During that duel, Khosumet was nearly killed by one of Chargris' fireball blasts before being rescued by Utgar's magic. Of course, when one is rescued by Utgar, it is only so that they might live to fight in the evil Valkyrie's armies on the fields of Valhalla. Fortunately, or unfortunately, Khosumet seems to have found a new home within Utgar's dreadful cause, surrounded by legions of relentless warriors and monsters who all seem to fight a little harder and a little dirtier whenever the Anubian Darklord is nearby. I always like it when a hero unit the designers intended to pair with a specific squad bears a strong resemblance to the figures of that squad. It's both visually thematic and an immediate signal to new players to start experimenting with armies containing the two units even before reading their cards. And this is certainly the case with Khosumet and the Anubians, with the Darklord's sculpt closely resembling the wolves while standing out just enough from the pack with his light clothing and handheld equipment. But the visual similarities of these two units will quickly draw players to Khosumet's price of 75 points, as much as a single squad of his wolf brothers. In terms of stats, those 75 points will buy a player a hero whose only immediately noteworthy stat is his move of 6, and even that is unremarkable next to the Anubians. Similarly unremarkable is his attack of 3, which, while average attack in Heroscape, is actually worse than the expected attack value of the Anubian Wolves' Unleashed Fury power we covered earlier. What is remarkable about Khosumet is his poor survivability for his points. While Khosumet's life of 3 at 75 points is bad in and of itself, what's always bothered me most about him is his defense of 3. We are led to believe this guy is one of the best fighters the Anubians have to offer, but a single Anubian wolf has better defense than Khosumet at base 4 defense. While it's true Khosumet has overall higher survivability than a single wolf if one multiplies life times defense stats, consider that if you count each Anubian wolf in a squad as a life point, a single squad of Anubians has 12 total survivability on that formula, while Khosumet only has 9 for the same points. One might counter with the reminder that since Khosumet has 9 survivability and a single Anubian wolf has only 4, he's still tougher than his lower kin. But that doesn't do it for me. Consider in this same expansion wave, we get Sir Denrick, a hero meant to visually and mechanically pair with the Knights of Weston. Even though Denrick is a hero with extra lives, he still has the same base defense stat as his knights, which can't be said for Khosumet and his wolves. Even more mystifying to me is the fact that Khosumet has a freaking shield, which last I checked, tends to help a person defend themselves. The writers even mention Khosumet's shield, explicitly, in his bio, and describe the Darklord as well practiced in the art of defense. Bullshit. But, if I gave Taylor a pass in our Wave 1 video for his own unimpressive stats despite his combat prowess and the lore, I should do the same for Khosumet. Certainly, I don't think every hero aesthetically similar to a specific squad should always mirror that squad's stat line in the game. And despite what my editorial a paragraph earlier may suggest, there are useful things Khosumet brings to the table. Like most cheerleader units, much of Khosumet's points are in his support powers, those being Relentless Assault and Unleashed Fury Enhancement. Starting with the former, Relentless Assault buffs the normal attack stat of any friendly figure with the relentless personality that is adjacent to Khosumet by 1. Before even getting into Relentless Assault's mechanics, there are details about it I was always struck by. As far as I know, it's the only personality-based attack buff a figure provides to adjacent recipients in official Heroscape. Relentless Assault also has an unusual name when compared to similar attack buff powers. Most comparable adjacency contingent attack buffs have attack in their power names, suggesting at a glance what stat is being increased with it. Finn the Viking Champion has Attack Aura 1, Marcus Decimus Gallus has Soldier Attack Enhancement, the Demutive Guard has Devourer Attack Enhancement, and you get the idea. Regardless of its unconventional name, Relentless Assault works identically to the attack buff examples mentioned, just confined to recipients with the Relentless personality. Like all attack buffs, its value can be roughly judged by its effect range and its roster of eligible recipients. And on the latter point, the Relentless personality does have some impressive units under its umbrella. Of course, the Anubian Wolves are an obvious first unit of consideration given their thematic and lore connections to Khosumet, and every attack stat modification of Unleashed Fury that the Wolves could roll into would have an extra point of attack added to it if the attacking wolf was next to Khosumet. Besides the Anubians, with Khosumet being an Utgar unit, a player's mind may go next to the collection of Relentless units the Dark Valkyrie has in his menagerie. 3 notables stand out in the classic lineup. The first is Krug, who with his Wounded Smash double attack combo could be dropping 2 attacks of 10, 20 dice in a single turn if he were at 1 life and adjacent to Khosumet. Next are the Wolves of Badru, who bond with Khosumet and so can more easily set up his buff in a single order marker. And thirdly, there are the minions of Utgar, who with Deadly Strike dramatically increase the value of each point put into their attack stat. We should also note that with the new Relentless Utgar Kairi heroes released so far in Age of Annihilation, the value of Khosumet's buff increases yet more, especially since these 2 new Kairi units, Kairi Warriors Rei Lin and Leviatech, pair well with the minions. Leviatech in particular allows for an attack reroll once per turn on any dice that did not show skulls, which could be used to devastating effect on a Khosumet buffed minion. On top of that, she herself would reap great benefit from Khosumet with her own Deadly Strike. There aren't too many noteworthy recipients of Relentless Assault outside of the Utgar faction in official Heroscape, though it is fun to think about Khosumet making the odd Venok Viper or Air Elemental slightly angrier than usual at their opponents. And even within Utgar, I think it's a poor use of 75 points if the only reason you're drafting Khosumet is for this buff. There's currently only 1 Relentless unit in official Heroscape that bonds with Khosumet, that being the Wolves of Badru. And so outside of that one pairing, in most cases, a player would have to use a full order marker just to move Khosumet into position, and then another to move whomever he might buff into adjacency with him. That's why I think players should see Relentless Assault as a nice, occasional bonus, but by no means something to design an army around. No, the real reason to draft Khosumet into an army is for his Unleashed Fury enhancement. Like other D20-based enhancement powers, Khosumet's second power adds 1 to any D20 roll for the Unleashed Fury power on any army card that has it. And in official Heroscape so far, that only applies to the Anubian Wolves. This takes us to the question every Anubian Wolves player has asked themselves at some point in their Heroscape lives. Do I spend those 75 points on Khosumet, or leave him behind and take another squad of Wolves for the same price? To answer that, we need to remind ourselves of how Khosumet's enhancement affects Unleashed Fury. First off, by adding 1 to any roll, Khosumet eliminates the possibility the Wolves will self-destruct, which can make a player feel better about not drafting another squad of Wolves who by themselves run the risk of all dying from bad D20 rolls. This also has ripple effects across the other Unleashed Fury probabilities. We discussed in our previous section on the Anubians that Khosumet raises their expected attack value from 3.55 to 3.95, and he specifically does this by doubling the likelihood of Unleashed Fury's highest tier of potential attack. The chance of the Anubians reaching an astounding 9 base attack goes from 5 to 10% with Khosumet on the team. Put another way, Khosumet takes the probability of a wolf self-destructing and transforms it into an additional 5% likelihood of achieving 3 attacks of 9 with Unleashed Fury. Meditate enough on that, and an argument in favor of bringing the Darklord along does start to materialize. But the fact that there's even a question at all about whether or not to include Khosumet is kind of my point. He's nowhere near as essential as other comparable support heroes alongside their visually similar squads. Consider Marcus Decimus Gallus with his Roman legionnaires. Marcus can bond with his troops, buff their otherwise slow move to 5, and offers an occasional attack buff. Or consider the Venok Warlord and his Venok Vipers. Mittens offers a D20 enhancement power of his own to the Viper's Frenzy ability, along with buffing the Viper's very fast 7 move to an outstanding 9. For the Romans and Venoks, there are vanishingly few scenarios in which a player leaves behind their hero counterparts. Even at 100 and 120 points respectively, Marcus and Mittens are utterly indispensable to those builds. Not so with Khosumet. The Darklord has little place in any army outside of the Anubians, and even then he feels like an ask for the points. Since he's a cheerleader unit, he will likely be left in a player's start zone until the end game. But nearly all other cheerleader units, like Marcus, Mittens, Warden 816, or Atlaga the Kyrie Warrior, have stat lines strong enough to at least do something meaningful in the cleanup phase of a match. For his 75-point price, Khosumet's stat line is, frankly, pathetic. There's very little he'll do to influence the outcome of a game if he's all you have left against your opponent's remains. It's true you could draft a squad or two of Wolves of Badju or Death Knights of Valkyrie to give Khosumet some figures to bond with, which taken together could be a serviceable endgame cleanup force. But the Anubian Wolves are fairly pricey themselves, and a core of 3 or 4 squads of them, with Khosumet, and then a couple Badgers or Death Knights, leaves little wiggle room in most standard-sized games for other important units you may need to smooth out your potential matchups. Personally, I don't think either of these bonding squads are that good a pairing for Khosumet anyway. Badgers won't get Khosumet's attack buff on their special attacks, and Death Knights won't get the buff because they aren't relentless. And if the only reason a player is bringing either squad is for so frivolous a purpose as giving Khosumet a few endgame bodyguards, then I don't think they're making good use of those points. Besides, Khosumet's poor stat line means his survival into the endgame isn't a foregone conclusion. A distant, well-placed Savaris could snipe him dead in one turn, and you may well wish you brought another squad of wolves instead of Khosumet if that ever happens. Sadly, as much as I love the Anubians, I have their champion at D tier. The designers created a fun, swingy unit in the Anubians, building into their powers one very unlikely chance a wolf will die each turn on a bad D20 roll. And oftentimes, it feels like Khosumet's only role in official Heroscape is as an overpriced band-aid to fix the Anubians' one liability. Not the most flattering position for a unit to occupy in the game. To give the Darklord his due, though, granting the Anubians a 10% chance to hit 9 attack can be a positive and meaningful influence for Khosumet to exert across a game. And whenever I run the Wolves in casual matches where I care less about winning and more about enjoying the rare sight of a fully thematic army, I always bring Khosumet. It's just fun to give the Anubians their proper commander on a battlefield. Whether or not I'd ever bring Khosumet to a competitive event, however, is another matter entirely. And now we'll take a look at the community rankings for Khosumet the Darklord. Classic and Delta formats have him at C-, and both VC Classic and VC Delta have him at D. And we can see him discounted both in Delta and VC Delta by 15 points, a slightly bigger discount than the one his Anubian brethren received. Still, they way outperform him in overall power level. Look, I like the guy, but he really is out of his league when next to his Anubians, whatever the lore would have you believe. You're not fooling us with your stupid cardboard shield, Khosumet. We now move on from the Anubian Wolves build and pivot back to Jandar with our next unit, the Knights of Weston. Belonging to a proud and righteous chapter of knights founded in the 15th century by Sir Denrick of Weston, these valiant warriors have made the protection of the weak and innocent the central mission of their order. At the heart of their chivalrous culture is their founding document, the Sanctity of Honor, written by Sir Denrick himself. Outlined in this text is the knights' guiding credo that cowardice, not defeat, is the ultimate dishonor, and that it is better to die in battle against a winning opponent than it is to flee in hopes of preserving one's life. So profound is this doctrine that the knights hold even their enemies to this standard. It is said that a knight of Weston will slay a retreating foe, not solely because he wishes to defeat them, but also because he doesn't want his opponent to suffer the supreme dishonor of cowardice. It was during a battle on Earth against an enemy force far outnumbering their ranks that Sir Denrick and his knights, on the brink of total defeat, found themselves suddenly transported to the world of Valhalla. And after arriving, they soon realized the great Valkyrie General Jandar had looked upon them with enough favor to recruit them into his cause in the battle of all time. The knights must have been grateful to the noble Valkyrie for granting them an escape from an unwinnable battle back on Earth, while at the same time preserving their honor. For even against insurmountable odds back home, the Knights of Weston did not rout. Now they hold the enemies of Jandar to the same code they have held themselves to since their founding, cutting down anyone cowardly enough to run from an honorable warrior's death. There are some units so ubiquitous in Heroscape discussion that it's challenging to say anything new about them. The Knights of Weston are one such unit. Much like their fellow valiant Jandarians in the 4th Massachusetts line, the Knights have remained one of the most highly regarded common squads in official Heroscape. As such, they have been played, and continue to be played, so often in so many competitive environments that consensus on them has long since been reached. The Knights are good, very good. Having said that, I believe the Knights earn their reputation in more intriguing ways than a mechanically stale A-rank unit like the 4th Massachusetts line does. Starting with their stats, the Knights share many immediate similarities with a unit we covered in our Rise of the Valkyrie video, the Tarn Viking Warriors. At 4 figures per squad, an order marker on either the Knights or the Tarn yields a player a lot of activations and board development options per turn. The Knights also have exactly the same base stats as the Tarn, being a melee unit with a slow move of 4, average attack of 3, and a sturdy defense of 4. Right away though, we see the Knights have an increased price at 70 points per squad, 20 more than the Tarn, and so a new player comparing the two units will wonder what it is the Knights are bringing to the table that warrants the increase. Quite a lot, as it turns out. The Knights swap out the Tarn's Berserker charge power for 2 others, Human Champion Bonding and a Coward's Reward. Starting with the former, we've discussed in previous videos that the value of a bonding power can be judged in part by the quality of units it allows bonding with. And Classic Heroscape presents a Knights player with 7 solid Human Champion bonding options that each deserve some discussion here. Atop the roster alphabetically is the Highland Brawler Alistair McDurk, whose strong base attack of 5 and ability to attack twice in a turn once per round make him an excellent choice for any Knights army in need of a heavy hitter. The Knights can also bond with all 3 of Classic Heroscape's Viking champions, those being Eldgrim, Finn, and Thorgrim. Eldgrim's high mobility potential and expendable nature make him an excellent early game glyph grabber, and Finn and Thorgrim provide +1 stat buffs to friendly figures adjacent to them. Finn offers +1 to the attack of adjacent friendly melee figures, and Thorgrim offers +1 to the defense of all figures, melee or ranged. In addition, all 3 Vikings, upon their own deaths, can offer their spirit buffs to any unique unit in a player's army. Eldgrim's spirit increases move by 1, Finn's spirit increases attack by 1, and Thorgrim's spirit increases defense by 1. And then there are Classic Heroscape's 3 knightly human champions, Sir Denrick, Sir Gilbert, and Sir Hawthorne. Of the 3, Denrick and Hawthorne are the most straightforward to understand in terms of what they offer a Knights build. Since Denrick is a hero released in Wave 2, we'll dive deeper into what he brings a player later in this video. Suffice it to say here that Denrick is another heavy-hitting option if a Knights player expects to go up against any huge-size figures. And Sir Hawthorne, very simply, offers a player great stats at a great price of 90 points, though baked into that price is a very small chance he might betray a player at any point during a game. From Alistair to Hawthorne, we can already see the Knights have some quality choices for bonding heroes that can set them up for success into a lot of matchups. But this is all before discussing by far the most important unit for the Knights on the Human Champion roster, that being the tremendously effective Sir Gilbert. So significant are the benefits this one hero offers the Knights that he alone propels them into the highest tiers of competitive builds. Gilbert was released as part of the Crest of the Valkyrie expansion wave, which saw each of the original 5 Valkyrie generals receive their own flag bearer with powers dependent on Valkyrie combat dice. We will eventually do a video on this channel covering each of the flag bearers in greater depth, but no coverage of the Knights of Weston is complete without devoting some time to what Gilbert does for them, particularly through his signature ability, Jandar's Dispatch. To summarize Dispatch, a player first takes a turn with Gilbert. Then, that player chooses up to 4 squad figures they control who follow Jandar and are within 8 clear sight spaces of Gilbert. They then roll their entire set of 12 Jandar Valkyrie dice. The number of Jandar symbols rolled equals the number of spaces the 4 chosen squad figures may then each move. Importantly, these spaces are additional to any movement those figures would do during the normal movement phase of their turn. For a Knights player, this means they can reveal an order marker on the Knights card, bond and take a turn with Gilbert, then roll for Dispatch to see if any Knights are moved through that power. And after any movement earned from the Dispatch roll is complete, another full squad of Knights can take a full turn with both a movement and attack phase. In other words, a player can move Sir Gilbert and 8 different Knights across a board, a staggering 9 figures in a single order marker. A player could also choose to double develop the same 4 Knights moved by Dispatch on their own normal movement phase, creating a squad of Knights that may very well move 6 spaces or more before the opponent gets a turn. Or a player can simply do a combination of both as the battle demands. We'll save our discussion of the probabilities associated with Jandar's Dispatch for when we cover Sir Gilbert in a future Flag Bearers video. For now though, we can at least start with the probability of rolling a Jandar symbol on a single combat die, which is around 17% likelihood. And across a full set of 12 Valkyrie dice, it's not unreasonable with that probability to expect 1 or 2 Jandar symbols will appear on any Dispatch roll with Gilbert. For a Knights player, that means 4 Knights can usually be moved 1 or 2 extra spaces before the Knight's formal movement phase begins. So if a player dispatches and normal moves the same set of 4 knights in an order marker, the Knights of Weston with Gilbert could be said to have an expected movement of around 5 or more. That's pretty remarkable for a 70-point 4-figure bonding squad when taken together with the Knight's other base stats. And that's not even accounting for the rare instances where 3 or more Jandar symbols appear on a dispatch roll, which could raise a Knight's movement in an order marker to an absurd 7 or higher. Analyzing the movement potential of the Knights, with or without Gilbert, dovetails into discussion of the Knight's other impressive power, a Coward's Reward, as this power's value comes in large part from how much board control the Knights can achieve over the course of a game. Justified in the Knight's lore blurb as their intolerance of cowardice among themselves and their enemies, a Coward's Reward means that a Knight rolls 2 dice for disengagement attacks and passing swipes against enemies that flee engagements with them. To understand just how strong this is, however, warrants some discussion on what goes into disengagement attacks in general. As any Heroscape player will know, disengaging is a key component of the game, both for a disengaging player and their opponent. It gives a player the option to risk a wound in order to escape a dangerous situation, or obtain a more favorable position on a board. A player can also use the threat of disengagement to force an opponent into making those risky plays, which can yield a player free wounds into the enemy. Since disengagement attacks are auto wounds, a figure being attacked by a disengagement roll cannot roll their own defense. So on ordinary disengagement rolls of a single combat die, a player has a 50% chance of rolling the skull symbol needed to inflict the wound. Many times, the benefits obtained from disengaging are worth the coin flip risk, as it could grant a player height when they didn't have it previously, or the chance to capture a valuable glyph like Wannock or Dagmar at the end of a round. This is especially true for figures with multiple lives, since as long as a figure has at least 2 lives left, they are guaranteed to survive a single disengagement. But engagements in Heroscape stack, as do disengagement attacks if a figure is disengaging from multiple enemy figures. If a figure is engaged with 2 figures and then disengages from both, the opponent rolls 2 dice for disengagement damage. That means that the likelihood of rolling at least 1 skull on the disengaging figure goes from 50 to 75%. This is particularly concerning for single-life figures, since they are now likely to be destroyed when disengaging from 2 or more figures. And for multi-life figures, not only are they now likely to take at least 1 wound of damage, but there is also a 25% chance they'll take 2 wounds. Such situations greatly discourage disengagement, no matter the benefits that might be received from doing so. Now throw Coward's Reward into the equation. A single Knight of Weston can force an opponent into the same disengagement decision structure it would normally take 2 figures to set up. Anyone disengaging from a single Knight is now likely to be injured, which means the vast majority of squad figures in Heroscape will be killed most of the time when fleeing from a single Knight. A Knight also retains that 25% likelihood of inflicting 2 disengagement wounds on a retreating enemy, a danger a player would ordinarily need 2 figures to impose on their opponent. Since it's possible for a figure to strafe around another figure they're engaged with without disengaging, it's conceivable that if an opponent's figure is engaged with 2 of your own, they could disengage from 1 figure and remain engaged with the other so that they're only taking 1 disengagement attack. But imagine if 2 Knights of Weston were to engage an opponent's figure. Then even if that opponent wanted to disengage with 1 Knight and dance around the other, that opponent's figure would still likely take at least 1 wound. And if they were to disengage from both Knights, then at least 1 wound of damage is all but certain. When one understands how dangerous a single disengagement with a Knight is, the possibility of an important hero getting engaged by 2 or more opposing Knights becomes a terrifying prospect for the player facing them. With Knights coming in squads of 4 and at so affordable a price of 70 points, it is very likely 3 or more squads will be present in an army, giving a Knights player a lot of figures to spread out across a map to set up such engagements. And once a figure becomes multi-engaged by Knights, it's usually best for the player controlling that figure to just hunker down and try to kill the Knights instead of disengaging to go for an opponent's more important figures. This is another situation in which the Knights excel. With the high number of Knights a player can easily field, combined with their base 4 defense, the Knights can soak up a lot of low to average level attacks from an opponent across a game. And even that 4 defense can be improved by Thorgrim, one of their many bonding options. Taken together, a mass of Knights can severely hinder an opponent's development options onto a board, with the opponent's fear of getting multi-engaged by the Knights influencing how they position their own figures. Because of this, the Knights also make for one of the best screening units in Heroscape. They can fan out ahead of important support figures, or lock a target in place so they can be gunned down by range units on subsequent turns. On the latter point, Knights are frequently seen alongside 4th Massachusetts line, since the Knight's Valiant personality integrates with the 4th Mass's Valiant Army bonus, and on every turn the Knights take when setting up their screen, they can attack and bond with a human champion. That means that in addition to their work locking down enemy figures, they're usually capable of dropping 5 attacks in a turn, sometimes more if they're bonding with Alistair or Sir Hawthorne. The Death Reavers are a good unit to compare the Knights to in this area. While the Death Reavers are better than the Knights at developing into and clogging up a board with their greater mobility and ability to be moved outside of their turns via scatter, the Rats are nearly useless in offense with their base 1 attack. The Knights, by contrast, with their base 3 attack, can still inflict steady damage across a game if attacking often enough, allowing them to double as frontline infantry in addition to their strengths as a defensive unit. And the Death Reavers will never force their opponents into the same level of engagement danger as the Knights will. The only solace an opponent might take in facing the Knights is that they're somewhat slow. 4 base move means the Knights, though high in number and tough to kill, are developing at a pace just shy of average. But even here, the Knights have Sir Gilbert as a response. Jandar's Dispatch means the Knights can usually raise themselves to 5 or higher effective move on an order marker, if speed is called for in a fight. And it can help a few Knights that a player doesn't intend on activating to close the gap with nearby enemies to lock them down ahead of a squad of 4 Knights taking their own normal turn. And frankly, this discussion here is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of all the subtle maneuvers possible with the Gilbert Knights partnership. What's mind-blowing to me is that while 1 or 2 Jandar symbols is roughly expected on dispatch rolls, there is always a non-0% chance that even higher numbers of symbols are rolled. It's not impossible for a Knight of Weston, with Gilbert, to move 8 or more spaces in a single order marker on a lucky roll, and the ambient threat of a dispatch roll like that adds a level of unpredictability to the Knights that makes them that much harder to fight. There's just no way around it. The Knights of Weston are a high A-tier unit. They were A rank when they released and have remained so ever since. For anyone with even cursory knowledge of competitive Heroscape, very little if anything that I've said in this section will come as a surprise, and the ranking I've given the Knights here is inevitable and unchallenging. What I hope I've shown, though, is that while an excellent unit, the Knights' high ranking is earned through a more complex series of synergies and decision-making processes a player fielding them faces than, say, a unit like the 4th Massachusetts line. When building a Knights army, a player has to think about bonding options as well as board development and positioning to set up engagements for the ever-frightening Coward's Reward. This is especially true when bonding with Sir Gilbert, as a player must decide how to distribute any extra movement points earned through dispatch across their army of Knights, in addition to the Knights' normal movement phase. The main reason the Knights aren't quite S-tier is because of the existence of some meaningful counters to them. Powerful squad killers like Braxis and Zelrig can take down plenty of Knights before the Knights ever kill them. Gladblast armies are great at removing a Knight's player's development power with the Gladiatron's Cyberclaw, forcing any Knight engaged by a Gladiatron to cease all movement. And of course, figures with disengage, such as Death Reavers or most figures in Grutt armies, are also good answers to the Knights, since disengage renders useless the otherwise dangerous Coward's Reward. In fact, the very presence of Knights in any meta increases the value of any unit with disengage precisely because of how useful it is not to be subjected to Coward's Reward. But even in matchups against these figures, I think the Knights still fare a decent chance of winning for all the reasons we've outlined. I've heard it said that there exists a sort of trinity of elite bonding melee squads in official Heroscape, made up of the Axe Grinders of Burning Forge, the Heavy Grutts, and indeed, the Knights of Weston. While that view may be a bit outdated in the evolving meta of today, all 3 of these 4-figure bonding squads offer such excellent combinations of powers, stats, and bonding options that they will always remain top contenders in competitive play. Maybe the most controversial thing I'll say in this otherwise safe piece on the Knights is that I think there's a case to be made that of those 3 squads in the Trinity, the Knights are the best. I might go as far as to say they're the finest all-round melee squad in the game. And even if another Braxis-quality Squad Slayer is released in Age of Annihilation, I don't see the Knights' A rank here or anywhere else being challenged anytime soon. And now we turn to the community rankings for the Knights, and, no surprise, they're straight A's across all formats. Somewhat surprising to me is the fact that they're only increased by 10 points, both in Delta and VC Delta. I would have thought it'd be higher with how consistent they are, but I trust the community on the pricings. Either way, whatever the format, the Knights are still excellent. Next, we come to one of Official Heroscape's absolute OG killers, one of the greatest tabletop miniatures ever created, and a hero that needs little introduction to anyone familiar with the classics. I speak, of course, of Utgar's most famous juggernaut, the massive troll powerhouse named Krug. A native of Feylund, Krug was summoned to Valhalla by General Utgar, who found in the troll bruiser a monster of tremendous strength and ferocity. Krug is best known as a warrior whose anger and power grow with each injury he is dealt in battle. His sword, Skellblade, is one of the nastiest looking melee weapons in Official Heroscape, a gruesome bludgeon as tall as a full-grown human and made from the armors of those Krug has slain in combat. When Krug attacks with Skellblade, he does so in sets of 2 devastating swings, smashing harder and harder with each wound the enormous troll sustains. Though dim-witted and foul-smelling, Krug has the capacity, both in the lore and on the tabletop, to obliterate any defense and destroy any opponent that stands in his way. When I was a kid, Krug was my favorite unit in the game, and I know I'm not alone in that. He really is one of the most beloved characters in Heroscape, with much of his charm coming from his instantly recognizable sculpt and his sheer size. In fact, the big troll has a distinction of being the only huge-size figure released in a standard expansion wave of Classic Heroscape, with other huge figures like Charos, Torkulna, and Zelrig all being released in either large expansion waves or in fully fledged master sets. The practice of including huge-size figures in standard expansion waves would become more common during the D&D run of Heroscape, but Krug set the precedent all the way back in 2005. That all said, I think the main reason Krug is so fondly remembered is how perfectly his combination of powers and stats matches his character, both visually and in the lore, creating one of the most beloved and charismatic units in the entire roster. In terms of raw stats, Krug immediately jumps off the card with his exceptionally high 8 life, a life count matched only by a few other heroes and surpassed only by Charos in Official Heroscape. All of his other stats are average, with a base move of 5, melee range of 1, poor attack of 2, and standard defense of 3. But when you combine his 2 powers with his stat line, Krug quickly becomes the monster he is in the story. He is blessed with the always valuable double attack, allowing him to normal attack twice in a turn, either against the same target or 2 different targets. However, it's his second power, Wounded Smash, that truly brings the Krug magic to the table. For every wound marker Krug takes on his card, he adds 1 to his attack stat. So a Krug with 2 wounds gets his attack buffed from 2 to 4 with double attack. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see how incredibly powerful Krug becomes with that combo. There are very few heroes in Official Heroscape that benefit from taking wounds, and those that do can't capitalize on those wounds nearly as much as Krug can. Ever Scarcarver from the D&D expansions, for example, has his Frost Rage power that increases his attack and defense stats by 1 for each wound on his card, plus his Double Assault power, which functions similarly to Krug's double attack. But to activate Frost Rage, a player has to reveal their X order marker on his card and give up their ability to fake out an opponent with a decoy order marker. And at only 5 lives, the most Evar Scarcarver could get out of Frost Rage is 4 extra points into attack, so he will never hit anywhere near as hard as Krug can. There is another extremely powerful hero that Krug does compare to with his Wounded Smash power, that being the Incredible Hulk from the Marvel Master Set. Mark Ruffalo matches Krug's 8 life and has very high 6 attack and 6 defense. But he also possesses his Rage Smash 5 power, which allows Hulk to increase his attack value on normal attacks for each wound on his card, up to a maximum of 5 extra attack. So Hulk is capable of dropping 11 or more attack in a single turn if he's charged up enough. But we already can see 2 areas where Krug surpasses Hulk. Hulk can only raise his attack by 5, whereas Krug could theoretically raise his attack by 7, and Hulk can only attack once per turn with Rage Smash, while Krug can attack twice. Anytime a non-Marvel unit outperforms a Marvel hero in the very thing that Marvel hero does best, take note. Even though Krug has, understandably, less survivability than the freaking Hulk, with 8 lives and a standard 3 defense, and in most metas where official Marvel units are banned, Krug is still going to take time for an opponent to bring down. And it's during that time that Krug will be charging himself up to, as we've discussed, Marvel hero levels of attack. That's what's so frightening to me about facing him. To kill him, you have to first make him obscenely powerful, and pray he doesn't engage a priority target on your team before he dies. But this presents a problem to a player running Krug in their army. To get him to an attack level that'll do damage needed to earn his points, you have to inch him closer to his demise. You want to expose Krug to some damage so he can raise his attack, but Krug, unlike the Hulk, can often find his wounds piling up faster than one would like with his middling 3 defense. This can be especially problematic when Krug is running through high volumes of ranged fire. If he's been brought down to 2 lives from a ranged barrage before he's gotten off any attacks of his own, then, even though he'll be charged up to tremendous attack levels, your opponent only needs another turn or 2 to bring him down. And if that were to come during an initiative switch, Krug could easily perish before ever attacking at all. I think there's a sort of sweet spot with Krug of 2 to 5 wounds on his card. Anything less, and he's only threatening figures with 2 or less defense with his weak attack. Anything more, and he's so close to death, it's risky to gamble on his continued survival if he's surrounded by multiple figures. And unfortunately, Krug by himself is going to struggle in scenarios where he's facing large numbers of figures, ranged or otherwise. Not only can he get easily dropped by concentrated attacks from large mobs of common squads, but even if he engages a few with his Wounded Smash double attack combo, he'll be wasting his incredible offense on low value targets if he stays put. No, with a hero like Krug, a player wants to position him so that he can engage other powerful heroes like a Nilfheim, Major Q9, or Torkulna that might be present in an opponent's army. And this leads me to my main argument for why Krug is so good. He is quite possibly the best duelist in official Heroscape, as there are few if any heroes in the game that can survive a one-on-one fight with him if he's unwounded. This is because Krug will always get 2 attacks per turn, and there aren't many heroes in official Heroscape who can produce more than 1 attack per order marker on their own. The few that can usually aren't rolling more than 4 dice per attack, if even that. While 4 attack is still respectable, Krug, though only starting at 2 attacks of 2, will progressively get stronger over the course of a duel. His opponent, by contrast, is fixed at a certain attack value, and so the momentum of a duel will always be on Krug's side. Heroes with high attack values don't fare much better against the Mighty Troll either. Aside from Krug, the only hero in official Heroscape that can drop 5 attack or more twice in 1 order marker is Alistair Me-Burq-Sa, and he can only do that once per round with his overextend attack. That means that all units with the strength to drop 6 or higher attack in an order marker are only doing so in a single attack, and such units stand little chance against Krug in a 1v1 melee. What's remarkable about this is that, aside from the Iron Golem and the 1st Sergeant Drake Alexander from the Rise of the Valkyrie Master set, every figure in official Heroscape with 6 or higher attack costs more than Krug, some quite a bit more. So when you realize Krug can reliably kill a Nilfheim at 185 points, or a Jotun at 225 points, the 120-point troll quickly reveals himself for the incredible bargain that he is. That said, situations where 2 unwounded heroes engage themselves without any support are pretty rare in competitive settings, and players with an understanding of how devastating Krug is in 1v1 melees will do everything they can to prevent those from forming. When I've faced Krug in competitive events in the past, I've tried to leverage any range I had to start chipping away at his life count early. I don't love doing it knowing how strong I'm making him, but I have to kill him somehow, and I'd prefer to start the process before he can engage any of my units. As Krug does approach my units, I try to get him to engage my less valuable expendable units, so he's spending his powerful attacks on units I can afford to lose. And generally, that strategy, and variations of it, are the counters to Krug. If he's approaching, get your heroes away and intercept the troll with squad figures if you have them. Even these may not deter an opponent's Krug gunning for your important figures, as due to Krug's nature, the opponent won't mind disengaging from a few cheap interceptors you've sent out. In these instances where Krug is destined to engage one of your most powerful figures and a brawl with him is inevitable, expect whomever he strikes to be killed, and so surround Krug with more attackers than he has attacks to deal with. If you can get the jump on a 1-life Krug, with only 3 defense, most units in the game stand a fair chance of killing him. By contrast, for a player running Krug, their task is to deny the opponent such opportunities. That may mean holding Krug back until problem ranged units that could soften him up before he engages are dealt with, or that could mean deploying any squad killers you may have brought to thin out the opponent's numbers so Krug can't get as easily mobbed. The good news is that at 120 points, drafting Krug still leaves a player with plenty of points left to draft other units to assist with Krug's poor matchups in standard game sizes. But seeing Krug as a unit you need to protect from bad matchups isn't always the right way to look at him. Precisely because he's so affordable, Krug can and should be seen as a unit you can draft to help smooth out the matchups of your entire army. If you've built a team that has a high volume of figures and some range, but lacks something strong enough to crack open the armor of a high defense unit like Major Q9, Krug can be drafted to give your army a way to bring down such tanks. This takes us into covering the most famous type of build Krug often finds himself in, that being armies made up around a core of arrow gruts. As a beast class hero, Krug can bond with the arrows, allowing a player activating the arrows to first take a turn with Krug. Since the arrows themselves only have one base attack and defense, they are in especially dire need of something strong enough to deal with high defense enemies. Krug is that response. An old Arrowgrut's army archetype involves several squads of Arrowgruts, a few Swog Riders to buff the arrows, then either Me-Burq or Krug as their most powerful bonding hero. It's rare that a player has enough points to build a robust Arrowgrut army with both Me-Burq and Krug in it, so that player usually must decide which of these two heroes would be better in a particular meta. In the past, I've leaned towards Krug, though recently I've seen compelling cases for Me-Burq. I've shared my views on why I thought Krug was the better in previous videos, but to summarize here, I used to think Krug simply offered more to the arrows for more matchups than Me-Burq did. I thought Me-Burq, despite his excellent mobility, range, and crowd control power, simply lacked the offensive punch that Krug brings, which is important in dealing with some of the best heroes in the game. At the time of making this video, I'm still educating myself on the strengths of Krug versus Me-Burq with the arrows, but it seems to be a matter of whether an Arrowgrut's player anticipates going up against more squads or more heroes. If the former, take Me-Burq. If the latter, take Krug. Naturally, when bonding with the Arrowgruts, a player develops much more thoroughly onto a board than they would with Krug in isolation. You can advance Krug in the direction of the target you need him to take out, while also having your nimble arrows snag height and set up pods with their Swog Riders. Bonding with Krug also makes 5 attacks possible in a single order marker, 2 from Krug and 3 from a squad of Arrowgruts. Of course, when playing this army, a player has to carefully judge when to bond with Krug and when to bond with a Swog Rider to set up a position to buff the arrows. And since the Swog Rider is a hero also released in Wave 2, we'll spend more time analyzing the decisions he forces on Krug and Me-Burq players later in this video. Suffice it to say here that if the arrows didn't have Krug as a bonding option, they would be regarded as much less competitive than they are with him in the mix. And the arrows also lift up Krug's utility with their bonding, giving the troll some grunt troops to watch his back and take out mobs that could slow him down on the way to much juicier targets. I think Krug is an example of the best of Classic Heroscape's design philosophies. Create a character with a clear personality in the lore, give that character a stat line and power set that's easy to remember and reinforces said personality, and top it off with a cool sculpt to make the character visually stick in a player's memory. On those criteria, Krug excels. When playing him, you really do feel like you're commanding a big, dumb, angry lummox who could utterly pulverize any figure on your opponent's team, and that feels good. But big, dumb, angry lummoxes can be outwitted and outmaneuvered, and Krug in his rage can often overextend himself or get carried away in his fury to the point that he dies before he's had a chance to make a difference in a game. As we've discussed, there are clear ways to defeat Krug and clear ways to use him to his fullest, and when used to his fullest, I think Krug earns a spot in A tier. I can hear some objections already popping up saying this is too generous because, as we've discussed, Krug can easily be countered by lots of common squads and ranged fire. And fair enough, but I think his ability to bond with the arrows gives him some sort of response to those scenarios, just as he gives the Arrowgruts a response to dangerous, tough-to-kill heroes. And it really is impressive to me just how much raw power Krug brings to a player for a budget 120 points. If you put an unwounded Krug next to any other hero in official Heroscape and have the two duke it out in melee, Krug wins virtually every time. He beats Jotun, the unit with the highest base attack in the game. He beats Major Q9, capable of 3 attacks of 3 in 1 turn with his own very high survivability. Krug even wins against units with powers that dilute attack strength, like 1 shield defense. In official Heroscape, those are currently Crixus and Meagle Ironwill. And while not an ideal use of Krug, the troll will usually chew through their average life count speedily enough, even with 1 shield defense. There are still some heroes to be mindful of when using Krug. Units that can attack or inflict wounds indefinitely, such as Deathwalker 8000, Sir Hawthorne, and Sujoa, pose a threat to Krug since they can conceivably kill him before he can drop any attacks of his own. I found Sujoa, and to a lesser extent Estivara, to be fairly effective counters to Krug. Sujoa in particular, whose Poison Sting special is set to 4 attack, has a good shot at dealing at least 1 wound on Krug. and once a wound is inflicted, you simply keep rolling the d20 to add more wounds on top of that until you roll a 1 through 9. I've one-shot a full-life Krug with a successful poison sting chain, and so the giant bug is a unit to watch out for if you're playing Krug. Charos can also present a danger to Krug as a unit with extremely high survivability and counterstrike. It's true that counterstrike will often end up working in Krug's favor, but Charos has the stamina to occasionally outlast the Great Troll in a fight, and shouldn't be underestimated. But other than those units, there really aren't any heroes that can be relied upon to deal with Krug by themselves. Even the mightiest heroes of the Marvel Master Set, such as Abomination, Thanos, and yes, the Incredible Hulk, shouldn't feel safe around Krug. It's quite possible he nearly beats any of them in 1v1 melees. And finally, aside from all the gameplay reasons I think Krug earns A tier, he simply has too special a place in my heart for me to rank him any lower. He brought me quite a bit of happiness as a kid, and was one of the main anchors that kept me coming back to Heroscape anytime I took a hiatus from it. Even people I grew up playing Heroscape with who moved on from the game can still recall Krug with clarity, and always with a laugh and a smile. You just gotta love him. And so, thank you, Krug, for bringing me and so many Heroscapers so much joy over these many, many years. May you continue to smash your way into the hearts of everyone who plays with or against you for many more years to come. And now we come to the community rankings of Krug in the competitive landscape, even though he's actually ranked S tier A+ in all our hearts. He doesn't rank quite as highly in competitive play, but is certainly still relevant, with an across-the-board B+ rank in all formats. Krug also receives a price increase of 5 points in Delta and VC Delta, costing 125 points total. I imagine the reason for why he doesn't rank higher is because there are lots of units that can easily avoid him or gun him down. But it's nice to see that even with counters that exist for him, he's still well regarded. And hey, if for some reason he drops in the rankings in a future update, I can always riot. Up next, we come to the Marro Drones, Heroscape's first Marro Common Squad, and the first Marro squad to be released in an official expansion wave. Before Wave 2, what little players knew of the Marro as a race came from the Rise of the Valkyrie Master Set through the Marro Warriors and their warlord, Me-Burq-Sa. We knew at the time the Marro were vicious, slimy, bony creatures who communicated telepathically and possessed bioengineered weapons and bodily augmentations. Unsettling enough. But the Marro Drones confirmed what many players suspected, that the Marro are in fact a race driven by a hive mind, separated into castes that are given different levels of autonomy within the hive intelligence. The drones, predictably, represent the lowest class of the common Marro, and their vast numbers form the backbone of any Marro horde. They are fearsome, mindless creatures, requiring telepathic guidance from a hive or Marro field commander to perform in battle. As such, their masters only give them primitive blade weapons to fight with. But don't be fooled. When the drones rally into a swarm and hurl themselves at their enemies, there's little hope of halting the tide. The reveal of the Marro Drones always felt to me like a subtle turning point in the early lore. I was always struck by how well the drones acted as a form of world building, purely through what was printed on their card. Their name and their single power, Hive Swarm, confirmed the kind of society the Marro come from, and imbued their whole species with a particularly alien quality. It also hinted at the Marro being a faction the game was intent on gradually developing with subsequent releases, with the Marro roster of today being one of the most fleshed out in the game. As the lowliest grunt troops of the Marro race, the drones are a standard 3-figure melee squad with range of 1 and attack and defense of 3. Where the drones should pique a player's interest is in their above-average move of 6, and this plus their low cost of 50 points per squad and their Hive Swarm power are what give the drones an edge in an already crowded hive of Marro units to choose from. Hive Swarm as a power has parallels to the Anubian Wolves' Unleashed Fury and the Marden Hound's Wild Pack movement, in that it requires a player to roll the d20 before starting the drone's movement phase to determine an effect. But while the Anubian Wolves and Marden Hounds do their rolls to determine modifications to attack and move stats respectively, the Marro Drones roll to determine how many figures they can activate in a turn. 1 through 12 activates 3 drones, 13 through 16 activates 6, and 17 through 20 activates 9. This means Hive Swarm allows a player to take a full turn, both movement and attack phase, with 1, 2, or 3 full squads of drones in a single order marker. And I'm hard-pressed to think of any other unit in Heroscape that gives a player the possibility of moving and attacking with 9 figures on an order marker. Of course, big swarms are never guaranteed. On their own, drones have a 60% chance of only activating 3 drones in a turn. Then they have a 20% chance of activating 6 drones, and another 20% chance of activating 9. This means that most of the time, a player will only be able to activate 3 drones in a turn. But unlike the Anubian Wolves or Marden Hounds, a single squad of drones can't fully capitalize on their D20 powers by themselves, especially when D20 rolls are good. Since there's always the possibility that 6 or 9 drones might activate on any Hive Swarm roll, players running the drones should position themselves to seize upon those fortunes by drafting at least 3 squads into their army. In truth though, even 3 squads, the absolute bare minimum a player should draft, really isn't enough to realize the potential of the drones. In a 3-squad scenario, as soon as a single drone dies, that player can never again activate 9 drones in a turn, even with a 17 through 20 roll on the D20. And with the drone's poor survivability, it's easy for them to die to average strength attacks. So at least 4 squads of drones is recommended so a player can still lose a few drones and keep their activation potential at maximum. Personally though, I don't even think 4 squads is enough. In my experience, to make the drones really shine, a player needs 5 or more squads of them. My own preference is 6, but certainly no less than 5. In classic points, 5 to 6 squads of drones, a mass of 15 to 18 figures, costs a player only 250 to 300 points, leaving plenty of room for supporting units. A player could certainly draft more, but 7 squads or higher means a player in standard-sized games has around 150 points or less to work with. That eliminates some very powerful units that synergize with the drones from consideration, but we'll come to those later. For now, I want to focus on what the drones by themselves can accomplish when drafted in sufficiently high numbers of 5 or more squads. Let's first return to the idea of activation potential as it relates to the drones. This I imagine as being the maximum amount of figures that can be activated on a given unit at any point in a game. This is similar to the more generic idea of order marker utility, a concept often on display with unique squads. When a unique squad has all of its figures on the board, an order marker spent on them produces maximum order marker utility possible for that unit, since a player can activate all figures in the squad in a single turn. As soon as one figure from that squad dies, however, that unit's order marker utility begins an irreversible decline, dropping with each death in the squad. However, at any point during a game, a player running a unique squad will always know their activation potential on a turn with a unique squad, namely, that being the number of figures that squad still has on a board. That potential diminishes with each death in the unique squad, but it's never a mystery to a player at the start of a turn. Common squads are less subject to order marker utility problems, since they can be drafted in multiples. For most traditional common squads, a player can usually expect full order marker utility on them for several turns if multiples of that squad were drafted. Even after a few deaths, as long as enough figures of that unit to fill a full squad are still on the board, order marker utility remains at max. Similarly, activation potential on such squads remains at maximum until they are down to less figures than the number in each multiple of that squad drafted. Usually, order marker utility and activation potential are essentially the same thing for a unit, but the Marro Drones force the distinction between those two concepts. Because of Hive Swarm and the uncertainty behind it, as long as there is a sufficient number of drones still left on a board, the drone's activation potential can be quite a bit higher than just 3 figures, the number of drones in each multiple of their squad. For that reason, the drones should be played, and armies around them designed, with the idea of activation potential in mind. A player shouldn't expect to get 9 activations of drones on any turn, but the longer they can keep the potential of 9 activations alive, the longer they position themselves for the rare moments when such rolls happen. Having huge numbers of drones on a board lets a player extend the life of that incredible activation potential across the length of a game, which leads us into exactly what that potential can do for a player and to their opponents. A common fallacy that I and many other Heroscape players can and have fallen into is looking at a unit's D20 reliance and assuming that variability is a bad thing. Certainly there's much to be said about units that are consistent being better suited to competitive play compared to ones that aren't. But it's important to remember that a unit's uncertainty applies to both a player and their opponent. D20 reliant units might be frustrating for a player to field when their D20 rolls add an extra layer of unpredictability to the performance of those units, but it also means an opponent will struggle to plan their game and strategy around that unpredictability. Simply put, there are ways to leverage a unit's unpredictability against the opponent, and I believe the Marro Drones make this very easy for a player to do. High number of activations per turn are desirable in Heroscape because they provide lots of development options. With common squads, The question is usually whether to advance with already developed units or spend activations, bringing in backup from a start zone. The Marro Drones, with their high activation potential, however, allow a player even greater flexibility between these two imperatives. Unless a player is below 9 drones on a board, there's really no bad time for a Hive Swarm rush to trigger. If it comes at the start of the game, you've just advanced 9 of your figures out onto the board to start off the battle. If it comes in the mid-game, you suddenly have a ton of options for how to spread out your influence across the board. Do you further develop your position by moving 9 figures from your start zone, or do you send all 9 out to attack enemy figures in one turn? While 9 attacks of 3 without any buffs is a staggering amount of output, I think more interesting are scenarios when a player sends 9 drones out to do a variety of different jobs. A player might send a few out to attack, but if some of the 9 drones aren't in range of any targets, they can spend a few of their drone activations to grab glyphs, take height and deny an opponent from doing the same, and or develop a few from their start zone to replenish any deaths on the front line. Now imagine such scenarios from the perspective of someone playing against the drones. The opponent, like the drone's player, should expect on probability alone that only 3 drones will activate each turn. However, if the opponent is wise, they should plan for activations of 6 or 9 drones at the start of every turn of their opponent. My question is, how does an opponent to the drones prepare for a hot roll on Hive Swarm? Seriously, I'm asking. Because from my experience and imagining the different builds I would run against the drones, I don't really know the answer. Obviously, an opponent should try to grab height where possible and keep their figures away from places the drones could get height on them. But that's really all I can think of. And that's my point. It's very difficult for an opponent to plan their game around the unpredictability of Hive Swarm. Usually it won't trigger, but every now and then it will, and in those scenarios, an opponent will simply need to hope their figure's stats and the positions they've built up will be enough to mitigate the flurry of attacks the drones are about to drop on them. And even then, if all 6 or 9 drones engaged an opponent's figures during a Hive Swarm, the opponent, on their next turn, will likely be heavily bogged down dealing with those drones, limiting how well they can develop and making it harder for them to target any priority figures in the drone's army. I mentioned earlier that there are some powerful units a drones player can draft in their army in support of their horde. As we've said, with the drones being so cheap at only 50 points per squad, the recommended 5 squads and above still leaves lots of points, and therefore lots of options, for units a player could draft to enhance a drone's army. That said, there are 2 I want to focus on here that provide significant benefits to the drones in particular, those being the Marro Hive and the Hive Lord Subakna. It's from these 2 units that I base my recommendation for 6 squads of drones. Both the Marro Hive and Subakna are 160 points in classic points. Assuming the standard of roughly 500 points for a normal game, drafting either the Marro Hive or Subakna plus 6 squads of drones amounts to 460 points spent. Of course, different formats exist at different point limits, but since it's usually points prohibitive to draft both the Marro Hive and Subakna with anything more than 3 squads of drones, my approach to the drones is usually to draft either the Hive or Subakna, then fill up the rest of my army with as many drone squads as I can draft. If you can fit in some range to round out their matchups, great. But I'm a believer that the drones can overcome most matchups through sheer figure volume alone. Let's first examine the drones in tandem with the Marro Hive. This is a particularly thematic build, since the Hive model itself appears to show embryos of Marro Drones incubating in egg sacs inside the Hive's structure. With its hive mind power, a player running the Hive with the drones can usually freely put all of their order markers on the Hive and activate their drones through it. This also means that each order marker used on the Hive gives a player a chance to revive a dead drone through the Hive's Marro rebirth power. While there is only a 40% chance of a rebirth occurring, when a player is rolling for rebirth on every turn they take in a round, there is a good chance quite a few drones will be respawning as the living ones continue to battle it out in the center of the board. The drones are also great protectors of their Hive, given how easily they can engage and clog up the opponent's area of the map, and thereby preventing the opponent from getting attacks off on the Hive. But this build has a few limitations, specifically with the range of Hive Mind. Any drone being moved through the Hive Mind power must start their movement within 12 clear sight spaces of the Hive. While this range usually covers 2/3 or more of a map, there will usually be a few areas it can't reach, and so a player should be careful not to overextend their drones into those areas. This also adds a layer to what happens when 6 or 9 drones swarm, as it means all of the drones a player moves on those good swarm rolls have to also be in 12 clear sight spaces of the Hive. The Hive is an incredibly tall figure, whose line of sight point is at the top of its model, so it's usually able to see most places within a 12-space range. However, on maps with lots of line of sight blockers, a player also needs to be careful not to move onto a space where sight with the Hive might be blocked. But usually, these are manageable constraints, and the Hive Drones army can be very rewarding for a player running it, and an absolute slog for an opponent facing it. Next is the Drones and Subakna pairing. With the Marro roster being a highly D20 dependent one, there's a discussion to be had in drafting Subakna with most units of that race. Oftentimes, Subakna proves too pricey to include in armies that only have 1 or 2 Marro units. But when the entire army besides Subakna can benefit from his Hive Supremacy buff, the Hive Lord can easily earn his 160 points. Hive Supremacy buffs any D20 roll on a Marro unit by 1. For the drones, this means that the probability of activating only 3 drones goes down from 60% to 55%. While the probability of activating only 6 drones effectively stays the same, that extra 5% is transferred to the highest tier of Hive Swarm rolls. With Subakna, the drone's chances of activating 9 of their number in a turn goes up from 20 to 25%, now a full quarter of their Hive Swarm rolls. To put it another way, the chances of activating at least 6 drones in a turn rises from 40% to 45%. Like with Khosumet and the Anubian Wolves, the +1 to D20 rolls from Subakna can have a very pronounced effect when spread out across an entire game. But unlike Khosumet, Subakna is a unit with stats that could easily have meaningful impact on a battle. While the Hive Lord is a bit squishy for 160 points, his 6 move with flying makes him quite nimble. Most impressively, Subakna boasts the second highest base attack in official Heroscape. This gives the drones a response if they encounter a high defense hero like Major Q9 and need something to crack him open with high attack. That's something the drones lack in the Hive build, since they're stuck at base 3 attack. Many times, they can still grind an opponent down with lots of little attacks of 3, but I think the lack of a high attacker like Subakna produces a few more unfavorable matchups, so there may be an argument there that Subakna is overall the better choice. I'm not sold on that yet, since Marro Rebirth is incredibly effective with high volumes of drones, but Subakna has to be on the mind of any player designing a drones army. And finally, I think there's something to be said about drafting a large number of drones without either the Hive or Subakna. The extra points will give a player the ability to draft some range or hero killer units, since a range-heavy opposing army might be able to pick off the drones in the early game if the drones aren't rolling well for Hive Swarm. If an opponent took out enough drones from range early, it could be challenging for the drones player to rebuild their momentum after those losses. So adding in some range of their own can allow a drones player to better dictate their opponent's development. There are also a number of high attackers available if one passes on the Hive and Subakna. But personally, I think it makes sense just to take Subakna if a player thinks they'll need to break through enemy armor. I'm more interested in the drones-only scenario because I think it highlights how well the drones can do just on their own. They are still very unpredictable, both for the player and the opponent, and have the potential to thoroughly develop their board each turn. In a way, the drones are one of the purest melee squads in the game because, other than the uncertainty of Hive Swarm, they're really just stats. While their attack and defense are average, that 6 move really does pay off in large numbers. And a lot of the strategy of playing the drones simply comes down to the usual positioning considerations around height and engagement that are present for every unit in the game. Even if you get 6 or 9 activations per turn, it really doesn't change your calculus too much. You just have a heck of a lot more figures to play and attack with in a turn. Overall, I have a pretty high opinion of the drones. I like their simplicity and unpredictability, as well as the extraordinary feats they can accomplish with high rolls on Hive Swarm. It's worth mentioning that the drones have, quite possibly, the highest potential consecutive figure activations in official Heroscape. If a drones player gets the last turn on a round, gets 9 activations on their turn, then wins initiative on the next round and gets 9 activations again on that turn, they produce a situation where they get 18 figure activations before the opponent ever gets a chance to respond. And it is not easy to recover from an assault of that scale. I have them at B tier for this series, and the only reason for them not being higher is their unpredictability. It can be challenging to field the drones if they refuse to swarm, or only swarm once or twice in a game. But even a few rolls of 6 activations per turn can win the day in the right matchup. Like with any unit, there are figures to be mindful of when running the drones. Ranged figures can be a problem for the reasons we discussed, especially squad killing range like that of Braxis and Zelrig. Zelrig in particular can be extremely dangerous in the early game given the explosive nature of his Majestic Fire's attack. Since there will usually be large clumps of drones in a start zone, he can easily roast from afar. Counter-striking units can be dangerous too, since drones' armies are melee heavy and usually must engage their targets to attack. Charos, for example, will kill plenty of drones attacking him even when he's not being activated by an opponent. But the drones have two stellar builds available to them with the Marro Hive and Subakna that give them some ways to manage these bad matchups. The Marro were wise to invest the biomatter needed to produce the huge number of drones they've deployed on Valhalla. And here on Earth, and on the tabletop, I suspect the drones will remain fixtures of play for Marro fans well into Heroscape's revival era. Moving to the community rankings on the Marro Drones, we can see they're B ranked in all formats, and did receive a price increase of 5 points in Delta and VC Delta. Their new 55 points will make it a bit more challenging to field large numbers of them, but that's offset by significant discounts to the Marro Hive and Subakna, so Delta isn't really challenging their viability too much. The Swarm's solid wherever it goes, without becoming OP. Following up the Marro Drones, we come to the other Marro unit released in Wave 2, this time a hero. Standing before us atop his frightful Marro steed is Heroscape's second Marro warlord, Me-Burq-Sa. As a warlord, Me-Burq-Sa occupies one of the Marro race's leadership castes, a caste I always understood to be beneath that of the Hive Lord caste, but nonetheless a position of authority over lesser Marro. But there is a hierarchy within the Marro warlord caste itself, as evidenced by a rivalry Me-Burq-Sa was said to have with his fellow Marro warlord, Me-Burq-Sa. The lore states that there was a moment on their home planet of Mar where Me-Burq-Sa challenged Me-Burq-Sa for command of his forces, succeeding for a time in his coup. But Me-Burq-Sa does not tolerate treachery from his fellow Marro, and through means unknown, won back control of his troops from his would-be usurper. At some point during this conflict, Me-Burq-Sa inflicted some kind of injury to Me-Burq-Sa that left the horse-riding Marro with permanently diminished defensive capabilities. It's presumed that since both Marro warlords have been summoned to Valhalla by Utgar, Me-Burq-Sa and Me-Burq-Sa have settled their differences, at least temporarily. And while Me-Burq-Sa may no longer be top dog of the Marro warlord caste in the lore, there are still things he excels at on the tabletop over his former rival. We can see the effects of the injury Me-Burq-Sa dealt Me-Burq-Sa through his very low survivability of 3 life and 3 defense. While Me-Burq-Sa has some immunities to auto-wound and auto-destroy powers as a large-size figure, he's still pretty squishy, and shouldn't be expected to last long in a melee. Where Me-Burq-Sa becomes most interesting is in his exceptionally fast move of 8, along with his 6 range and 3 attack. 6 range is average for ranged figures, but 3 attack is respectable for any ranged figure in official Heroscape. And 6 range plus 8 move, the highest base move in the game, give Me-Burq-Sa an impressive threat range of 14. Me-Burq-Sa also has his paralyzing stare power, which allows him, when targeting a small or medium figure, to eliminate that figure's ability to roll defense with a d20 roll of 16 or higher. But Me-Burq-Sa is an unusual case in which his stats are just as interesting as, if not more interesting than, his lone power. The fact is, Me-Burq-Sa has one of the most effective stat lines for his points of any unit in the game. At only 50 points to draft, Me-Burq-Sa doesn't need to make a huge impact on a game to earn that price tag. But because of all the way his stats interact with one another mechanically, Me-Burq-Sa will often kill well over his points over the course of a battle. We should note here, too, that Me-Burq-Sa is another unit affected by the recent Renegade price increases. But just like with the 4th Mass earlier, I want to focus on what Me-Burq-Sa used to be to understand the context behind that increase. Whatever his price, his base stats will never change, and Me-Burq-Sa's excellent speed lets him easily take height and shoot down on targets with 4 attack at 6 range. If that target is a small or medium figure, and you get lucky with Paralyzing Stare, you could very well put 2 or more wounds on that target from a single shot. And if no figures can reach Me-Burq-Sa on the opponent's turn, he can then reposition to a spot far away from where he started to snipe at someone else. That's really the trick with Me-Burq-Sa. To get the most out of him, you need to keep him from getting engaged for as long as possible. 3 life with 3 defense isn't terribly hard to get through if he found himself ambushed by 2 or more squad figures. And with only 3 lives, even if he survived such an ambush, he probably wouldn't have many points left to feel completely safe disengaging from such a scenario. The problem with 6 range or lower for so brittle a figure as Me-Burq-Sa is that even if you try to put maximum distance between the warlord and his target, 6 is also pretty standard threat range for the majority of figures in the game. Most units in Official Heroscape have at least 5 move and at least 1 range, so any figures that survive Me-Burq-Sa's turn, who are within his 6 range on same level, can usually engage him if they activate on the opponent's next turn. This means that despite Me-Burq-Sa's outstanding mobility, he still has to get worryingly close to the fray to shoot his targets, and that makes it easy for an opponent to lock him down and prevent him from using that remarkable 8 move on his next turn. That's also part of why I think Me-Burq-Sa is such a well-designed unit from a mechanical standpoint. Yes, he's great, but to make him great, you have to be very judicious about what situations you put him in, and this means you have to pick his targets carefully. I generally think Me-Burq-Sa is best used behind or around your main force to target small and medium figures on the peripheries of your opponent's area of influence. That could mean targeting an opponent's frontline figure that's tied up in a brawl on the edges of a larger skirmish, or sniping at a valuable small or medium support hero that's sitting behind a screen of grunt troops. With his threat range of 14, Me-Burq-Sa has the freedom to run around and pick off the most vulnerable elements of the opponent's front line, even if they're in different areas of a big fight. But Me-Burq-Sa is only a single figure with only 1 attack per turn. If he's unprotected and swarmed by enemy common figures, he stands little chance of holding them back with 1 attack of 3. So it's rarely a good idea to send him out early in a game without backup. Fortunately, Official Heroscape has our boy covered. Enter Me-Burq-Sa's bonding options, 3 squad units that can activate themselves and the Marro Warlord in 1 turn. These are the Death Chasers of Thesk, the Swog Riders, and the Roman Legionnaires. Of these 3, it's largely the Chasers and the Romans that make Me-Burq-Sa such a competitive hero, as they provide him with much-needed protective screens to keep him out of engagements that might spell his doom. Let's first look at the Romans, since they were released long before the Death Chasers, and are one of the reasons Me-Burq-Sa was identified as a strong unit so early in his tabletop career. We covered in our Wave 1 video what makes the Romans such an effective unit on the board, in no small part a result of their warlord bonding power. Anytime an order marker is spent on the Romans, they can first take a turn with any warlord they have in their army, and Official Heroscape's impressive warlord roster is staffed in part by Me-Burq-Sa. For the same price as a single squad of Romans in the old points, a player could draft Me-Burq-Sa and provide the Romans with an option for ranged attacks, something most other warlords in Official Heroscape lack. There are technically 2 other warlords that have some form of range. The Dwarf Warlord, Mogrim Forgehammer, can auto-wound at 5 range via his commander's strike power. And more recently, Age of Annihilation has introduced the towering Eisenek Warlord, Ironlich Viscerat, who has a range of 5 and attack of 3. But these 2 warlords offer useful and flattering comparisons to Me-Burq-Sa. For one, the Marro Warlord outranges them both with his own 6 range. Mogrim's range is D20 dependent, and while it's cool that it bypasses defense stats, it will only ever deal a single wound of damage. Me-Burq-Sa's attack of 3 means there's always a chance he'll do more than 1 wound on each attack, and Me-Burq-Sa can bypass defense stats himself, with the 25% likelihood of a successful paralyzing stare on small and medium targets. All of this, Me-Burq-Sa does for 70 points less than Mogrim. The comparison to Ironlich Viscerat is much simpler. Me-Burq-Sa both outranges and outruns the Eisenek Colossus for 100 points less. And so we can see that not only does Me-Burq-Sa have the best ranged attack in the Warlord class, but does so while being the cheapest Warlord in the game. Sure, he has the worst survivability in his class, but that's where the Romans come in. In competitive settings that allow it, bringing Me-Burq-Sa along with a core of Romans is really a no-brainer. Of the squads Me-Burq-Sa can bond with, Romans are both the cheapest and the most numerous per squad. 4 squads of Legionnaires, 16 total figures, can be deployed for 200 points. Add in the auto-include Marcus Decimus Gallus along with Me-Burq-Sa, and you've still only spent 350 points in Classic. I'd probably throw in Mogrim or Nigaxa and spend whatever I have left on filler, setting up the Romans with 2 or 3 solid bonding options for the battle. Builds like these can be upwards of 18 figures that can usually advance up to 5 figures per turn with bonding. This makes it especially easy for the Romans to set up screens to protect Me-Burq-Sa early in a game. Next, let's discuss what the Death Chasers of Thesk offer Me-Burq-Sa as a bonding core. The Chasers are 1 less figure per squad than the Romans, and can't buff their defense stats by huddling together like the Legionnaires can. Where the Chasers stand out is in their base 4 attack, quite threatening from a common squad in large numbers. The Chasers' bonding power, Taskmaster bonding, allows them to bond with any large-size wild hero in their army. In official Heroscape, these taskmasters are Denrick the Glacian Swog Rider, the two hard-hitting ogre heroes from the D&D line, generic Swog Riders, and of course, Me-Burq-Sa. Most chaser armies will include Denrick to buff the chaser's poor defensive 2 to a more manageable 3, along with either an ogre Warhulk or an ogre Pulverizer, maybe more if points allow it. And just like with the Romans, I think Me-Burq-Sa is also an auto-include for the chasers. He's the cheapest bonding option for the chasers and is their only ranged bonding option, so the Marro Warlord is not only easy to fit into their builds, but also covers one of their mechanical blind spots. This means a player could draft Me-Burq-Sa, Denrick, 4 squads of chasers, and only have spent 320 points, leaving plenty of points in standard formats for either an ogre Pulverizer or Warhulk, with points still left to spare. While glacier than the Romans, the Death Chasers hit much harder with their base 4 attack and their Ogre Taskmaster's high offense. That makes for 2 competitive bonding armies in which Me-Burq-Sa is not only recommended, but indispensable. In both of these armies, I wouldn't feel comfortable moving out Me-Burq-Sa until my core units have spread out across the board in tandem with some of their bonding heroes. This provides the all-important screen protection Me-Burq-Sa will need to stay alive long into the game. It also gives you figures that can intercept units that might want to kill Me-Burq-Sa and prevent them from engaging. Death Chasers in particular, through their Orc Battle Rush, auto-develop every chaser in an army up to 5 spaces at the start of a game, and so a player may be able to safely move up Me-Burq-Sa a bit sooner when running them. Of course, when Me-Burq-Sa is one of several bonding heroes in a Romans or Chaser's army, a player needs to think about when to activate him or another hero during bonding. Many times, when a fight's gotten going, if a more offensive bonder is in your army like an Ogre or Mogrim, it makes sense to keep Me-Burq-Sa back and activate that stronger hero to keep up the attack. But having a ranged option you can call upon with any order marker on your bonding squad means you can threaten enemy figures that may have developed advantageous positions they'd rather not forfeit. That might be a Raylin, Taylord, or other cheerleader in the back of your opponent's forces that are actively buffing their front line. Your opponent may have set up a strong melee screen to protect their cheerleader units, but if they're in range of Me-Burq-Sa, he can shoot over that screen and start chipping away at their life counts. This can force an opponent to spend order markers moving their cheerleaders out of harm's way, sacrificing turns on their core units. But even then, Me-Burq-Sa's speed allows him to quickly reposition and continue harassing them, all while you're still activating your core bonding squad. This may mean putting Me-Burq-Sa closer than you'd like to the main battle, but that's the challenge, and fun, of playing him. If you're careless in how you move Me-Burq-Sa or his screen, he can drop like a fly before he's had any impact on a game. But if you set up your screen well, and are laser precise in how you position Me-Burq-Sa, expect huge returns. I'd be remiss here if I didn't add a note on the Grok Riders, the 3rd squad Me-Burq-Sa can bond with. The unfortunate truth is that even in a universe where Grok Riders were never released in official Heroscape, Me-Burq-Sa's strength in the game is virtually untouched. At the risk of spoiling my thoughts on the Groks in a future Wave 8 video, they as a unit are nearly irrelevant in classic points. And their Mark of the Warlord power, while deserving of study, would require Me-Burq-Sa to be engaged with the target, a situation he should generally avoid. They are by far his worst bonding option, and usually not recommended for him in competitive play at classic points. That all said, the Groks are a fast unit with base 7 move, so at the very least, it is nice they have in Me-Burq-Sa a bonding hero that can keep pace with them. And finally, with all the strength Me-Burq-Sa has purely on his stats and the 2 strong armies he bonds with, we've still not spent much time on his sole power, Paralyzing Stare. While I do think Me-Burq-Sa is strong enough to carry his weight even if he never succeeds in rolling for Paralyzed Stare, it's still a fantastic bonus a player should appreciate and take advantage of when the opportunity arises. What's cool about Paralyzing Stare is that it's the same range as Me-Burq-Sa's base range. It's not a power that demands he get closer than his max range to a target to pull off. There's also no stipulation that it has to be a non-adjacent target, so if Me-Burq-Sa is unfortunate enough to get engaged by a small or medium figure, you can still attempt the stare. While the roll for it is unlikely and shouldn't be expected or the center of one's strategy, Me-Burq-Sa can accomplish incredible feats with a successful roll. Aside from the simple fact that a target not rolling any defense makes it almost certain Me-Burq-Sa will do damage or kill on his attack, there are some highly defense-dependent units in the game that Me-Burq-Sa is uniquely well-equipped to assassinate. The now-defunct Hasbro Heroscape website had an FAQ section on Me-Burq-Sa that identified the Sentinels of Jandar and Krav Maga agents as great targets for Paralyzing Stare. The Sentinels are extremely tough to kill with their Shields of Valor power, which makes every shield rolled on their defense count for 2 shields rolled in actual defense value. and the Krav Maga agents, or any unit with stealth dodge, can block all range damage by rolling a single shield. Take away either of these units' ability to roll defense, and watch how quickly Me-Burq-Sa drops them for a huge points trade-off. Other great targets of Paralyzing Stare are figures with one shield defense like Crixus, or units with counterstrike like Samurai who, if they were to engage Me-Burq-Sa, the Warlord could paralyze and remove their ability to counterstrike wounds back into him. That leads into a cool way to use Paralyzing Stare when Me-Burq-Sa is faced with multiple targets of differing defensive capabilities. While it's common for someone to attack the same figure they attempt Paralyzing Stare on, there's actually no requirement they have to be the same figure. You could attempt to paralyze one figure, then, if that fails, target another figure with your normal attack. So if an enemy Sentinel and an enemy Aerogrut are both within shooting distance of Me-Burq-Sa, a player, understanding the Sentinel is the more valuable target, could attempt to paralyze the Sentinel first. If the stare is successful, obviously go for the Sentinel on your attack. But if the stare fails, you can then use your attack on the Aerogrut or another weaker figure you're more likely to kill. Paralyzing Stare should also inform a player about what types of targets to keep Me-Burq-Sa close to, small and medium figures. You want Me-Burq-Sa to have lots of options to paralyze, and you should always attempt paralyze on the most valuable or most defensively tough small or medium figure he can reach with it. The outcome of that paralyze roll will then tell you who to target with your attack. If he's in an area of the map that has lots of large and huge figures, he won't have that flexibility to play with this power. So, as you choose your targets with Me-Burq-Sa, try to give him lots of options, and roll for paralyze every opportunity you get. I've now read close to 5 pages of text explaining all that Me-Burq-Sa can do, from his stats, to his bonding options, to Paralyzing Stare, and all for a unit that only costs 50 points in Classic. Me-Burq-Sa brings an inordinate level of power to the game for how little he costs to draft, and rightfully earns a place in A tier on this list. I even think he's borderline S tier at his Classic cost, and is only held back by how fragile he is and how intentional a player has to be in protecting and moving him. We haven't even talked about what a terror he can be if saved until the end game, where his superior mobility and range can often make short work of the scattered remains of an opponent's army. And it's worth noting that Subakna can be drafted to bump the chances of a successful paralyze from 25 to 30%. But unless Me-Burq-Sa is part of an army of other units that will benefit from Subakna, the points spent on the Mighty Hive Lord are better spent elsewhere. 25% chance on paralyze is just fine for Me-Burq-Sa all on his own. And in competitive Heroscape, Me-Burq-Sa will often be on his own, separated from his fellow Marro and fighting alongside the strange company of Romans and D&D orcs. The fact that Me-Burq-Sa is often considered an auto-include in both of these builds goes to show just how much utility the designers crammed into his Classic 50 points. He doesn't have to do much to earn those points, but in the hands of a skilled player, he can often kill far, far more than that. I may go as far as to say that Me-Burq-Sa is the best unit in Wave 2, and after his defeat at the hands of Nigaxa, armor damaged and ego bruised, I don't think he'd be unpleased to hear that. And now we move on to Me-Burq-Sa's community rankings and points adjustments. A's all around for the Marro Warlord, and a hefty price increase of 30 points in Delta and VC Delta for a final price of 80 points.
Hey everyone, it's Doggin as editor. Just wanted to let you know that since the time I recorded this section on Me-Burq-Sa, his Delta price has gone up even more. He is currently at 85 points in Delta, so actually a 35 point increase, not 30 points. So wanted to update you all on that. His power rankings have stayed the same. He's still A across the board, but he's just excellent. And yeah, we'll see if he goes up even more as the months go on. But currently, at the time of this video, he is 35 points. So just wanted to drop in and add that note.
Like the Fourth Mass, Me-Burq-Sa's price has only been going up with time. And as we mentioned earlier, Me-Burq-Sa also got a price increase from Renegade. He's now at 70 points in their format. Not quite as big an increase as in Delta, but sizable nonetheless. What can I say, the dude's earned it. Next on our list comes Heroscape's first Kyrie squad, the fearsome Minions of Utgar. These menacing red-winged warriors, like all Kyrie, lived on Valhalla long before the discovery of the Wellsprings that plunged their world into chaos. Prior to the outbreak of all-out war, this Kyrie tribe made its home in the mountains of Kyrian, where they practice a brutal style of hard-hitting combat peculiar to their culture. Perhaps this is what attracted the attention of General Utgar, who recruited their tribe into his horde before he discovered the wellspring that would set him on his quest to conquer all of Valhalla. Now, in the battle of all time, these vicious axe-swinging warriors enjoy a privileged status in Utgar's legions as some of his best and most trusted troops, carrying out the will of their master with utmost loyalty and cruelty. At the time of their release, the minions were tied with the Airborne as the most expensive squad unit available at 110 points per squad. Certainly at the time they were the most expensive common squad in the game. And while they can be drafted in multiples, in most formats, a player won't be able to draft too many minions before they approach their points limit. For those 110 points, a player gets a 3-figure melee squad with 4 move, 2 attack, and 6 defense. While 4 is below average in Heroscape, this is compensated by the minions' flying power that lets them ignore elevation. 6 defense is excellent for squad figures, and should bring some comfort to players anxious at how much they paid in points to draft these evil Kairi. 2 base attack is poor, but the minions' deadly strike power means they're often hitting quite a bit harder than figures with 3, 4, and even 5 base attack. With deadly strike, the minions can be viewed as the melee cousin of the Omnicron snipers, whose deadly shot power is functionally the same as deadly strike. For both the snipers and the minions, every skull rolled on an attack roll counts for an additional point of damage, so rolling 1 skull with the minions actually produces 2 points of attack, rolling 2 skulls with the minions produces 4 points of attack, and so on. We went into detail about how Deadly Shot transforms the attack value probabilities of the Omnicron snipers in our video covering the Wave 1 units of Classic Heroscape, so refer to that if you'd like to get into the nitty-gritty of the power. The shortened version here is that Deadly Shot and Deadly Strike make higher attacks possible with fewer dice, dramatically shifting probabilities in favor of the attacker. Even though the snipers have only 1 base attack, they're going to reach a real attack value of 2 with much greater likelihood than a unit with an actual base attack of 2. And those same probabilities exist for the minions. What the minions lack in the sniper's range, they make up for with an extra point in base attack. And this should alarm anyone destined to face the minions in melee. I argued in the Wave 1 videos section on the Omnicron snipers that even with Deadly Shot, they're really not earning their points price until they can buff their base attack to 2. This is usually done by obtaining height or drafting an attack buffing support unit like Taylord to get them to 2 attack. But the minions have that desirable deadly 2 attack all on their own, giving them a healthy chance of cutting through high defense stats without a single buff. And this is all before discussing the third power on the minions card, Utgar's Orders. This ability lets a player give up a turn with the minions and instead take a turn on that order marker with any Utgar-aligned Kairi hero that player controls. While not quite a bonding power, it does allow a minions player, running 1 or more Utgar Kairi, to put all of their order markers on the minions and adapt who they activate as the situation dictates. This is notable for the Kairi species in official Heroscape, as bonding is non-existent within the Kairi roster, and Utgar's Orders is the only power that allows any kind of order marker flexibility among Kairi units. And so, minions players are encouraged to include at least 1 Utgar Kairi hero in their army to take advantage of the options Utgar's Orders provides. In Classic Heroscape, Utgar Kairi heroes used to be a very small roster composed only of Taylor the Kairi warrior and Runa. It's fortunate, however, that we're covering the minions after the revival of official Heroscape, as the Age of Annihilation Master Set has given us 2 new Utgar Kairi heroes for minions players to choose from. These are Leviatek the Kairi warrior and the evil version of Raylin the Kairi warrior. That makes 4 different Kairi heroes the minions can use with Utgar's Orders at the time of this video. Starting out, there's Taylord, released in Wave 1 of Classic Heroscape and who was, up until the Age of Annihilation, usually the top Utgar Kairi choice for serious minions players. As we discussed in our Wave 1 video, Taylord provides the most generous attack buff in the game. Any figure in your army within 4 clear sight spaces of Taylord adds 1 to their attack, period. No restrictions. While no doubt helpful for any unit being buffed, the minions, and all units with Deadly Shot or Deadly Strike, benefit especially from Taylord's buff. With Taylord alone, the minions are rolling 3 dice in attack and are able to achieve a remarkable attack ceiling of 6 with much greater likelihood than a unit with base 6 attack. Get a minion attacking down on a target from height who is also within Taylord's aura, and that minion is dropping 4 attack dice with a frightening attack ceiling of 8. For perspective, 8 is the highest base attack in Heroscape, a stat only the giant hero Jotun possesses. Jotun's chances of rolling his full 8 attack are vanishingly slim, less than a 1% likelihood of happening, but a minion buffed by Taylord and height rolling 4 attack dice with Deadly Strike has a 6% chance of rolling all skulls and hitting 8 attack. But 8 attack is often far more than a player will need to damage most units in a game, and savvy opponents will do their utmost to deny minions players from getting height on them. So having Taylord in a minions army ensures they're still rolling at least 3 attack dice even on equal level with their targets. Since Taylord's buff is an aura that affects a large area around him, the minions have some freedom to position themselves for the best attack opportunity while staying in the aura, and Taylord can slip out of dangerous engagements using his stealth flying, with Utgar's orders being a good way to rescue him from enemy ambushes. The main downside to drafting Taylord with the minions is the enormous 180 point price tag he charges. So in classic points, Taylord and 2 squads of minions put a player at 400 points spent. Outside of larger point events, this usually precludes a player from drafting a 3rd squad of minions, and so players running Taylord with the minions are accepting that their points are being put into a very small number of figures that are much less expendable than they would be in armies that can afford an extra squad or 2 of minions. But the raw power Taylord provides his minions will often justify those 180 points. Let's turn now to the 2 Utgar Kairi released in the Age of Annihilation Master Set, as these heroes were the subject of much minion-related discussion ever since their official cards were revealed. Before the Master Set ever hit store shelves, it was clear that the minions were getting a boost in Age of Annihilation with Evil Raylin and Leviatech. The question is whether these 2 heroes, both significantly cheaper than Taylord, have any chance of dethroning him as the best hero to pair with the minions. Starting with Leviatech, she already compares favorably to her father Taylord in key ways. While slightly squishier with 1 less life and lacking the stealth variant of flying that Taylord enjoys, she, like the minions, has Deadly Strike, making her a much greater melee threat than Taylord if the minions activate her with Utgar's orders. Her biggest contribution to the minions, however, comes from her 2 powers, Brutality Aura and Dynastic Leadership. Dynastic Leadership buffs the move of all Utgar figures in an army with Leviatech by 1, so long as at least 1 other unique Utgar Kairi hero is also present in that army. While this demands a player spend points on another unit to achieve the bonus, the minions can be buffed to 5 move with flying, which puts them in the same mobility league as that of 2 other Kairi squads, the Einar Imperium and the Protectors of Ular.
Editor Doggin again. Just wanted to let you all know that I misremembered the move stat of the Protectors of Ular. For some reason in my mind I thought that they were 5 base move, but in fact they are 4. So the point I made does not apply to them, does still apply to the Einar Imperium. They are base 5 move.
This also makes it easier for the minions to snag height and get that juicy extra die of attack with Deadly Strike. But Leviatech's greatest asset to the minions has to be her Brutality Aura. A squad figure you control within 4 clear sight spaces of Leviatech, when normal attacking an adjacent target, may re-roll all dice that did not show skulls once per turn. That means that if 3 minions are within Leviatech's aura and are all attacking on a turn, one of them can re-roll any attack dice that didn't show skulls. It shouldn't take much imagination to understand how terrifying a prospect that is with figures that have Deadly Strike. After Leviatech, there's Evil Raylin atop her big cat thing. Manticore. Sure, whatever. Anyway, Evil Raylin is notable for having the best stat line of any Utgar Kairi hero, marginally beating out Runa and Taylord with her 6 life. And as a large-sized figure, she has some on-a-wound immunities, and so she also has the overall best survivability of the lot. Like Leviatech, the main way she helps the minions is with an aura power. In this case, Evil Raylin's terrifying aura causes any opponent's figure within 4 clear sight spaces of her to lower their defense by 1. Essentially, Raylin softens up targets for the minions without actually damaging them. And I do like how this is another way to increase the odds of the minions inflicting wounds without buffing their base attack. And finally, returning to Classic Heroscape, we come to Runa, by far the least desirable Utgar Kairi partner for the minions. Though nimble and easy to conceal behind cover due to her thin sculpt, her Helm of Mittensoul aura is a long-shot power. After moving and before attacking, Runa can use her helm, requiring that the player then roll the d20 for every figure, friendly or not, within 3 clear sight spaces of her. If you roll a 20 for any of those figures, you destroy them. No doubt impressive if it were to kill a Charos or Q9, but its unlikelihood brings into question how worthwhile it is to give up a turn with the minions to activate Runa through Utgar's orders. Not only that, but if a minion is in range of Runa's helm when she activates it, that minion risks being killed by her as well. For these reasons and others, Runa is unfortunately the odd one out in this group, though still an option for the more adventurous Minions player. The next question a Minions player faces is how to build their army around these heroes. Since the Minions are a common squad, a player should at least draft 2, thereby spending 220 points. Some interesting builds can now emerge, depending on how many points a player has to work with in an event. Adding in Taylord eats up another 180 points, but usually leaves enough room to squeeze in Leviatech for a total 480 points spent in Classic. With Taylord, Leviatech's dynastic leadership triggers for the whole army, and Leviatech can reroll a Taylord buff minion attack once per turn. The damage potential on a play like that is the sort of thing that can quite literally slay dragons, and will easily crush squad figures and mid to low level heroes. Other interesting army variants emerge when a player ditches Taylord and drafts Leviatech along with either Evil Raylin or Runa. In most cases, you'll want Raylin, but there's fun to be had running Leviatech with Runa. It's worth noting that Leviatech and Raylin together cost the same as drafting Taylord by himself, so not only will you still get the dynastic leadership bonus, but you'll have more points left over to spend on filler units to round out your matchups. In this build, you're trading Taylord's valuable attack buff for Raylin's debuff on enemy defense, plus extra overall army survivability and extra points left to spend on other units. Lastly, I think there's a conversation to be had about leaving behind Utgar Kairi heroes entirely, in favor of drafting more minions or other units to smooth out your army's matchups. This may seem unwise at first, but remember that the minions don't have to use Utgar's orders to earn their points. While the minions won't reach the same attack ceiling on their own as they would besides Taylord, they still hit plenty hard enough to do steady damage over the course of a battle without support. And their defense stats are strong enough that they're much more independent of support heroes than more traditional bonding units who ought to be bringing along at least one other hero or squad they can bond with. Plus, foregoing an Utgar Kairi in exchange for extra minions will give you some insurance in case a few whiff defense on ranged attacks before they can engage their targets, or if they whiff defense in the heat of a melee fight. The unfortunate part about running the minions, or any army with expensive single-life figures, is that a lot of your points are put into figures that only need one bad defense roll to drop dead, and with each minion costing around 37 points, every one of those deaths to bad rolls sets a player back quite a bit. This creates a few challenging matchups for them. And while every army and every unit in Heroscape can be played in subtle, skillful ways to maximize their effectiveness, I think winning with the minions is a lot more about understanding their matchups and building around those than it is about crafty plays. One bad matchup that comes to mind is against armies with vastly more figures than the minions. These are your armies with Arrow, Blade, or Heavy Gruts, Venok Vipers, Roman Legionnaires, and any other numerically superior build that can throw more attacks at the minions per turn than they can dish out. The minions' 6 defense is excellent, but as we've said, one lucky attack is all it needs to remove a minion from the board, and the more attacks that come their way, the sooner it'll be before one of them gets through their armor. The minions can only ever put out a max of 3 attacks per turn, so any army that overwhelms that attack volume stands a good chance of overcoming their sturdy defense. Not only that, but armies with lots of cheap squad figures will take quite some time for the minions to cut through with only 3 attacks per turn, all while the minions are trying to withstand high volumes of attacks themselves. Though the minions hit very hard, it's a real shame when that offensive power has to be used on cheap squad figures that most units in the game can take down with modest to weak attacks. Range-heavy builds are another matchup I think the minions struggle into for similar reasons. Even with their flying, the minions' 4 move means it'll still take them a while to reach their targets, and every turn they're not engaged with a target is a turn enemy range can fire into them. You might be building a steady momentum with 1 or 2 squads of minions flying their way to an enemy range camp, but any death of your minions on their journey to that enemy will stunt their momentum once you get there. If only 1 or 2 minions survive the gauntlet of range fire before engaging, then even Deadly Strike won't make up for their lack of attack frequency needed to swing things back in their favor. With the addition of Leviatech to the official roster, the minions do have a way to increase their mobility to 5 with flying, making it a bit easier for them to close the gap with ranged attackers. And it's actually possible to buff the minions' move to 6 with flying if both Leviatech and Atlaga the Kairi warrior are present in your army. You can even keep that army under 500 points in Classic if you drafted 2 squads of minions, Atlaga, Leviatech, and Evil Raylin. So perhaps this type of matchup can be more easily overcome in the Age of Annihilation. But there is one specific matchup the minions have that I don't think anything in Age of Annihilation will help them overcome, and that's against Braxis, one of Classic Heroscape's great dragons and the bane of squad figures the world over. With her poison acid breath power, Braxis, instead of attacking, can choose up to 3 smaller medium figures within 4 spaces of her and roll the d20 for each. If they're squad figures, an 8 or higher on the roll will destroy them. And unfortunately for the minions, despite their tall stature and board presence, they are classified as medium. So if Braxis were to get within 4 spaces of 3 minions, she has a 65% chance of destroying each of them, making it very possible she wipes out a full squad in one turn. Adding to that, with a 17 or higher on an acid breath roll, Braxis can take out a smaller medium hero, so there's a 20% chance she one-shots a full-life Tailord or Leviatech if they were within range. This matchup gets even worse when Braxis has a retinue of greenscale warriors to bond with, giving her figures that could tie down the minions to set up acid breath shots on future turns, while also throwing extra normal attacks their way. But it must be said that if a squad of minions buffed by Tailord engages and attacks Braxis before she can roll for acid, it's not impossible they could kill her in one turn with strong deadly strike attacks. That leads into the sort of playstyle I think the minions are well suited for. Because they lose a lot with each of their deaths, but can do tremendous damage if they can engage, I think the minions make for excellent ambushers. If a full squad can get the jump on a single tough hero target, they have a high likelihood of inflicting several wounds and even outright killing. The Utgar Kairi heroes make ambush plays more valuable with their various aura buffs, and Leviatech and or Atlaga give the minions a way to stay just out of enemy threat ranges, then rush forward with that extra point or 2 in movement. To achieve these ambushes, it's important to use the minions flying to their advantage. If you can't reach a target in a turn, try to set the minions up on perches that are difficult for the opponent to climb and engage them on. Think a few turns in advance to decide where your minions will jump to on their next order marker, then set them up. Sometimes the early death of an important hero can cripple an entire army, and if the minions can pull that off, they'll likely make their game environment much more favorable. But the fact is, Heroscape's wealth of common squad-heavy competitive armies produce an array of bad matchups for the minions, no matter how many points they can kill in ambushes. With how pricey the minions and Tailord are, a player's options for how to build their minions' armies are somewhat limited. And I think that sadly means there are some events you just don't take them to. That said, Age of Annihilation has breathed new life into the Evil Kairi squad with Leviatech and Evil Raylin, giving players who might have slept on them newfound reason to deploy them on the field. Because of their matchup dependency, mixed with their objectively strong stats and damage-dealing potential, I'm content at putting the minions at B tier for this list. For all their bad matchups, they do have good ones, and can achieve win conditions early if they drop 3 attacks of 3 with Deadly Strike on the central hero in a king army or similar build. And there is something to be said about their ability to tank with that 6 defense. While it's demoralizing when something as weak as a Martin Nagrub succeeds in getting through that defense, how often does that happen really? There are plenty of scenarios where a minion survives an onslaught of 6 or 7 attacks before that one lucky attack gets through. And that's not nothing. Heroscape isn't just about dealing damage to your opponent, it's about soaking up damage as well, and arranging your pieces in such a way that the right figures are doing the right jobs as much as possible across a game. The minions are well equipped for both. They can kill squads, they can kill heroes, and they can do a lot of both and absorb a lot of punishment before succumbing to attrition. I want to end our section on the minions with an anecdote. In our childhoods, the minions of Utgar were the favorite unit of my friend Sammy, with whom I played many hours of casual Heroscape growing up. Back when Krug was my #1 favorite unit, Sammy and I would duel a squad of minions against Krug, and you'd be surprised how close some of those games got. I have a lot of nostalgia for these guys, and I'm excited to see almost 2 decades later they're getting some love in Heroscape's official revival. I've seen discussion around the new Kairi heroes that seemingly writes them off. For the Utgar Kairi with minions at least, I'm not ready to join that crowd just yet. I'm a natural cynic and pessimist in most areas of life, except Heroscape, and am optimistic that there are discoveries yet to be made with Utgar's winged warriors in the Age of Annihilation. Now let's check in on the community rankings for the minions, and in Classic and Delta, they're at a respectable B+ rank, while VC Classic and VC Delta have them at a flat B. It's not a huge difference, but I am curious as to what influenced it. Maybe there's a few VC units that they struggle into or that act as counters to them, but I'm not sure. The minions are also down 10 points in Delta and VC Delta. I recall seeing them at 105 in an earlier update, so it appears they're going down in pricing. That's somewhat perplexing to me, given the new Age of Annihilation Kyrie they synergize with. But again, I've also heard lots of folks say the new Kyrie aren't much to write home about, so maybe they're irrelevant to the strength of the minions. I still think there's more to discover about them, but we'll just have to wait and see if that influences their pricings and/or rankings from where they stand now. After that mini marathon of Utgar units, we return to the Jandar faction with the penultimate unit on our list. Enter Sir Denrick, or as he's formerly known,
Denrick 420! In the chat! Coming at you live from the Riznasium! It's your boy, throwing down with those Galaxy Brave Blaze, let's go!
Or as he's formerly known, Sir Denrick of Weston. This valorous knight was the founder of the Knights of Weston and author of their guiding document, The Sanctity of Honor. Denrick formed the Knights of Weston by recruiting only the most chivalrous and honorable men he could find, inculcating in all who joined a sense of duty to defend the weak and combat those who would do them harm. It's unfortunate, then, that Denrick didn't detect in one of his recruits the warning signs of a jealous heart. A knight of Weston named Sir Hawthorne, consumed by lust for power and desire to unseat Denrick as leader of the chapter, committed an act of betrayal that nearly led to the obliteration of the Weston Order. In a surprise attack from a besieging army, Hawthorne opened the gates to the Weston's fortress, granting entry to an invading force so large it seemed destined to wipe out Denrick and his knights. It was in this moment that General Jandar summoned Denrick and what few knights remained to Valhalla, clearly seeing in him and his men a caliber of warrior befitting of the righteous army he was building. Denrick now leads the remnants of his once proud knightly order against the enemies of Jandar in the battle of all time, stunning friend and foe alike with his penchant for engaging the largest and most dangerous opponents in enemy armies. Denrick is the second hero in Wave 2 that's meant to visually and mechanically pair with a squad unit also released in this wave, the first pairing being Khosumet and his Anubian Wolves. Other than his exposed face and bright blonde hair, Denrick's shimmering silver armor and blue shield are exactly the trappings of a Knight of Weston, and the two units synergize smoothly via the Knight's human champion bonding power. Unlike Khosumet, however, Denrick has a strong stat line that not only gives him staying power on the board, but the capacity to drop meaningfully strong attacks over the course of a game. As a Knight of Weston, Denrick is predictably a melee unit. He has the same 4 defense as his knights, with a slightly higher, though ultimately average, base move of 5. His life of 5, combined with his 4 defense, give him a healthy survivability, which is helpful for his most impressive stat, 4 attack. While not earth-shattering, it puts him into a league of attack that can start threatening high defense figures. And as we can see with his powers, that attack rises to 6 when Denrick is attacking huge-sized figures thanks to his giant killer power. Denrick also shares a Coward's Reward, the trademark power of the Knights of Weston we covered earlier. A player gets all of this for 100 points. Of all the units in Wave 2, Denrick may be the most straightforward to understand. One glimpse at his card gives a player a pretty good sense of his overall place in the game. He's a Valiant personality unit, which immediately puts him in the roster of units orbiting the 4th Massachusetts line for Valiant Army builds. And as a human champion with such obvious visual compatibility with the Knights of Weston, Denrick has a seat at the table with the other human champions of Heroscape. Age of Annihilation has even given Denrick a new role as a Jandar champion, who can bond with the much-vaunted Frostclaw Paladins, arguably the biggest breakout star in competitive play from Renegade's recent releases. In fact, Denrick's class, faction, and species make him a bonding hero for 3 different squads in official Heroscape, the aforementioned Knights and Frostclaws, as well as the Me-Burq Warriors from Wave 3 of Classic Heroscape. And Denrick is one of 7 human champions and one of 7 Jandar champions, slightly different rosters depending on which squad Denrick is bonding with. While these are both illustrious clubs for Denrick to be a part of, membership in them inevitably invites comparison with his peers. As we laid out in our section on the Knights, official Heroscape's human champions include Denrick, the Viking champions Eldgrim, Finn, and Thorgrim, the Knight heroes Sir Gilbert and Sir Hawthorne, and finally, Alistair McDurk. The Jandar champion roster is nearly identical, and only swaps out Sir Hawthorne for Knight Irene from Age of Annihilation. Put another way, when it comes to which champion figures a player may want in a Knights, Me-Burq-Sa, or Bears army, Denrick has competition. I tend to look at these 8 different champions in 2 basic categories: support champions and attack champions. Support champions are heroes that don't hit terribly hard themselves, but offer important buffs to the units they're bonding with. These are Gilbert and the 3 Viking champions, who all provide useful buffs and synergies, but none of whom exceed a modest base attack of 3. Attack champions are the other 4: Alistair, Irene, Hawthorne, and yes, Denrick. What's printed on their cards doesn't offer any buffs to any units, but they all have considerable offensive potential. Alistair has the highest base attack at an impressive 5, with the ability to attack twice in one turn, once per round, using his overextend attack. Hawthorne has a solid 4 base attack, with a special attack of 3 that can fire off a theoretically unlimited number of times. Knight Irene also has 4 base attack, plus her Overwhelm special that lets her attack twice in a turn. And Denrick has his base 4 attack with the potential of 6 attack against huge-sized targets. Many armies built around Knights, Me-Burq-Sa, and nowadays Frostclaws use some combination of support and attack champions to bond with. For the Knights, Sir Gilbert is an auto-include, with Alistair being a popular addition to bring extra punch for tough-to-kill heroes the Knights may face. Frostclaws, as a unique squad, can benefit from all 3 Viking auras and can produce 6 total attacks per turn when bonding with their hero counterpart, Knight Irene. And the Me-Burq-Sa usually favor at least one human champion with a high life count, such as Alistair, Hawthorne, or Gilbert, to get the biggest buffs out of their Highland Fury power. And while different competitive formats can always shake things up, the army configurations I just shared are fairly archetypical builds for these squads. In none of those archetypes, you'll note, is Denrick to be found. The fact is, when compared with his fellow human and Jandar champions, Denrick is the least essential of the lot to the major builds he can bond with. What advantages he has over his peers are marginal at best, and while 100 points isn't an unreasonable price tag for what's on his card, it's not cheap either. And so a player in search of human or Jandar champions to bond with will naturally wonder if Denrick is the best use of those 100 points in a given build. Purely on stats, there's nothing Denrick does especially well. His base defense is average, with only Eldgrim and Alistair having less defense within the human and Jandar champions roster. His life count, while healthy, is surpassed by Alistair, Gilbert, and Hawthorne. And his base attack of 4, while good, is also surpassed by Alistair, who can drop that higher attack twice in a turn, once per round. That means Denrick, as a hero that can only attack once per turn, is outclassed in potential attack volume by Alistair and also by Hawthorne and Knight Irene. Alistair only costs 10 points more, Hawthorne 10 points less, and Irene exactly 100. But with Irene's special attack and ability to buff her own move to 7, Denrick is a hard sell even just compared to her. And while Denrick beats out Eldgrim on everything but his move stat, Eldgrim only costs 30 points, and has a very well-defined niche in the game as a glyph grabber with his own overextend attack. Heck, even Eldgrim can drop more attacks in a round than Denrick with overextend. Sir Gilbert was another unit affected by Renegade's rebalance of certain highly ranked figures, with his price now increased to 160 points. That's completely understandable given the tremendous support he offers any squad he can bond with. But historically, Gilbert was priced in classic points at the preposterously low 105 points, resulting in exceedingly few scenarios in which you would take the 100-point Denrick over Gilbert when the latter used to be that big a bargain. And I think one legacy of that old Gilbert price is the enduring perception that Denrick was never quite at the level of the other champions for what comparatively little he brought to the table. But Denrick does have his place in the game, even if that place is in the shadow of the other human and Jandar champions of Heroscape. I think many players looking at Denrick's card for the first time would say that Denrick's role is as someone meant to take on huge-size figures, and that's not wrong. But I think the real key to understanding Denrick lies in the fact that he is the only hero unit in all of official Heroscape with the Coward's Reward power, and the only squad unit with this ability is the Knights of Weston. So an order marker spent on the Knights bonding with Denrick will produce a movement of 5 figures that each have Coward's Reward, and there are some impressive maneuvers a player can pull off with this. We've discussed how Coward's Reward makes disengaging from any figure that has it very dangerous for an opponent, with a likelihood of at least 1 auto wound on the disengaging figure and a smaller chance of 2. Because of this, many times an opponent, if engaged by 1 or more knights, will decide to simply stay put and try to kill them rather than risk that disengage. After all, it only takes 1 point of successful damage to kill a knight. But that's not the case with Denrick and his 5 lives. The moment Denrick engages a target, suddenly that target is faced with a figure they don't want to disengage with, that also has the survivability to soak up quite a few attacks himself. So if a target figure decides to stay put and duke it out with Denrick in hopes of killing him, it could take 2, 3, or more turns to destroy him. That is, if Denrick doesn't destroy that target first. If Denrick and even 1 or 2 knights engage a target in one order marker, not only are they dropping a couple of attacks on that target in their turn, but they will all but certainly lock it down with Coward's Reward. And once locked down, more knights that weren't able to reach it on the previous turn can catch up. If a target was unlucky enough to be surrounded by Denrick and a full squad of knights, that target might have to endure 4 attacks of at least 3 and 1 attack of at least 4 in one order marker, with scarcely a hope of escaping the multi-pronged Coward's Reward they're now subject to. Most heroes in the game will be worn down by that many attacks, and it further prevents powerful, dangerous heroes from reaching more critical components of your army. You don't even need to attack with Denrick and the knights once they're engaged with their target. If your army also had range, like 4th Massachusetts line in a Valiant build, Denrick and some knights could lock down a priority target, then next turn, you can fire off a salvo of 4 attacks of 3 with Weight Then Fire, maybe 4 attacks of 4 if the 4th Mass are all on height. That'll take down plenty of heroes after enough shots. That's really where I think Denrick can make the most of his 100 points, leading a bonding squad in pursuit of important or dangerous multi-life heroes. While his giant killer power suggests you should send him toward huge-size figures, you don't need to go out of your way to do that. Any multi-life hero of any size makes for a good target to sick Denrick and his boys onto, especially if you don't want that hero developing any further onto the board. If he can earn his points in absorbing damage from, and doing damage to, the enemy without ever using Giant Killer, then that's fine. But Giant Killer is pretty cool when it triggers. I've seen it argued that engaging huge figures with Denrick often puts him in fights with figures that have equal or greater attack and usually greater survivability than he does, meaning those usually aren't fights he can win on his own. But you don't need him to win. It's enough if Denrick ties down a huge attacker like a Nilfheim or Fenhydra and then puts a few wounds on them, even if those monsters end up killing him. It can buy you some time to move the rest of your army into better positions on the board, and I'd much prefer an enemy Nilfheim spend his attacks killing Denrick than killing Gilbert if I had both in one army. And if you've activated Denrick a few times during that fight, by the time Nilfheim has finished him off, Giant Killer will likely have softened up the Great Dragon enough that the rest of Denrick's army can finish him off. Of course, there'll be times your opponent doesn't have any huge figures in their army, and that's okay too. Denrick works fine at locking down any hero you're worried about on the board. Even if that hero disengages to go after something more important in your army, Denrick will still have forced that target to take 2 disengage attacks. And just as Denrick doesn't need to go after huge figures to be effective, neither does he have to bond with his knights. He could pull a similar lockdown maneuver with a retinue of Me-Burq-Sa or Frostclaws. While the Frostclaws are a unique squad and can't be fielded in large numbers, they're also one of the new multi-life squad units being released in Age of Annihilation, with 2 lives per bear. So engaging an enemy hero with Denrick and a few bears puts some serious meat sponges in that hero's way. And for the Me-Burq-Sa, while they don't have the survivability of the bears and knights, they can charge up to absurdly high attack with their Highland Fury power. In such builds, it's critical to protect the Me-Burq-Sa's chosen champion for Highland Fury, not necessarily from damage, but from outright dying. So as long as Denrick isn't the Me-Burq-Sa's Highland champion, he can serve as that champion's head bodyguard. With a squad or 2 of charged up Me-Burq-Sa by his side, Denrick and company can drop a lot of pain onto whichever hero they're after, especially if that hero is huge. I hope to have shown here that Denrick is by no means a bad unit. He's got a respectable stat line, bonds with some outstanding melee units, and has the distinction of being the only hero in the game with Coward's Reward. Other than the opportunity cost of drafting different figures for his 100 points, there really aren't any major downsides to running him. His biggest problem is simply having to be compared to more desirable options. While Denrick can achieve 6 attack against huge figures, as we've said, not every army you'll face will have huge figures. For 10 points more, you can draft Alistair, who gets 5 base attack no matter what he's fighting, thereby making him more versatile into more matchups. For 10 points less, a player could draft Sir Hawthorne, who can't bond with the bears, but who has a slightly better stat line and a special attack that can fire off multiple times. The 100 points spent on Denrick could also be put to use drafting one of the Viking champions, who can add their spirit auras to any unique units in your army after they die. And if I was running the Frostclaws and had to choose between Denrick and Knight Irene, I'm taking Mama Bear most of the time for that extra attack on her Overwhelm special. Denrick's place as an attack champion for the Frostclaws is about to be further challenged by the upcoming Age of Annihilation unit, Knight Primus Adelburn. At the time of his release, Adelburn will have the highest life count out of any figure the Frostclaws can bond with. And while Adelburn is set to be the most expensive Jandar champion so far, he'll also have a power that lets him auto-wound one adjacent smaller medium figure or one adjacent smaller medium common hero before he attacks, an ability reminiscent of the excellent Orc champion Grimnak. That's a lot of utility Adelburn's going to have when bonding with the bears, and together they'll eat up 270 points of any army you're building. That raises the question of how valuable Denrick would be for that build over something else for another 100 points. If he can't be called bad, but can't be called great, then I think Denrick falls in C tier on this list, ever so slightly shy of B. He works, he's fine, but there are just better options for the points into a greater number of matchups. And unlike some other human champions, I think Denrick is especially dependent on a bonding squad to bring out his max value. I don't think I'd ever spend 100 points for Denrick by himself in a competitive format. If Denrick has any kind of superpower, it lies in his ability to bring a squad along with him as he locks down important enemy targets with Coward's Reward. Giant Killer as the first power on his card can sometimes distract from this, but consider that Agent Carr, also 100 points, will get 6 attack into anyone he's adjacent to with Sword of Reckoning, regardless of size. And that really says it all. Giant Killer is a bonus, but not the main reason to draft Denrick. You can get that level of attack elsewhere. I think it's best to look at Denrick as a tar pit. He'll last a good while into a game and can stop many figures dead in their tracks. And while I think he's best suited to dealing with other heroes, on his way to those targets, he can put a lot of squad figures that engage him in jeopardy. Like with the Knights, figures with either disengage or phantom walk like Gruts or ninja units will do little more than shrug at the sight of Denrick and the Weston boys. But those are a minority in the official Heroscape roster, so I'd say Denrick has more favorable unit-to-unit matchups than not. Ending on a positive note, I'm a big fan of the Torkulna Marden Nagrubs combo, and I didn't mention in my section on the Knights of Weston what a terror they can be for the Hive Lord and his snacks. Torkulna loves to run around with Trample Stomp, but if a bunch of knights engage him, they make attempting Trample Stomp a near suicidal affair. Bring along Denrick with those knights, and now you have a bonding hero that adds another layer of Coward's Reward, plus 6 attack into the Hive Lord. So yes, when I'm running Torky and his grubs and see Denrick on the field, I get nervous. In the right environment, Denrick really can be quite good. I just wish I had more good things to say about him. Now let's turn to what the community has to say about Denrick and their rankings and pricing. Denrick is a B-ranked unit in Classic and Delta, but drops to C in VC Classic and VC Delta. This is another case where I'm not familiar enough with how Denrick plays in VC metas to know the reason for that ranking drop, but apparently he does worse in those. In both Delta and VC Delta, he drops 25 points for a final price of 75 points. And I do like Denrick at that cost.
Hey everyone, it's Editor Doggin again. Just wanted to let you know that Denrick's price has also changed since the time I recorded this little section on him. So he is now down to 65 points in Delta, down 10 points from 75. So while it's certainly easier for Denrick fans to field him in Delta pricing, it does appear that the general opinion on him is that he is going down in meta strength. So that's where he stands now in Delta. His rankings are the same as what I discussed earlier, so his power rankings haven't changed to the different formats, but his price has, so just wanted to update you all on that.
Does that make him as essential as the other human or Jandar champions? No. But the points decrease does make him easier to slot into an army as a backup champion. And his stat line is good. Combine that with Coward's Reward at a 25 point discount, and yeah, he do be bussin', for real, no cap, on God. And finally, last and technically least, we come to the Swog Rider, the first common hero released in official Heroscape. In the Swog Rider, Wave 2 filled an important gameplay niche by introducing a hero unit that can be drafted in multiples within an army. As such, unless we're talking about Nerak on his fancy Glacian Swog, the Swog Riders pictured here aren't named characters in the lore. Rather, their place, both in Grut society and in Utgar's legions, is that of captains to lesser Grut orcs, specifically Arrow Gruts. It's said that when a Grut warrior displays exceptional combat prowess and leadership skills, they are promoted to the role of Swog Rider and given their own Swog beast to tame. Swog Riders endure rigorous training to ensure they're in sync with their feline mounts, after which they are then deployed as leaders of Aerogrut teams in the field. Through their leadership and presence near their troops, these beast-mounted Grut commanders inspire their lesser orcs to fight harder and nastier than they'd ever have the confidence to do on their own. Any discussion of the Swog Rider inevitably collides with discussion of the Aerogruts. They're just that closely bound in their mechanics. And the Swog Aerogruts combo forms the backbone of one of the oldest competitive builds in Heroscape, those being armies with a core of Aerogrut squads, supported by one or more Swog Riders, and usually augmented by either Krug or Mimring. All of these units have been available to players since the release of Wave 2 back in May 2005, and as such, this build and its constituent units are among the most well-studied in the game. Growing up, I used to think you always wanted to run one Swog for each squad of arrows you had in your army, but that's not a hard and fast rule. With how cheap each Swog Rider and Aerogrut squad is, there are several configurations of the Swog to Arrows ratio that a player can fine-tune to suit whatever meta they think they'll be going into. But in my admittedly limited experience within competitive Scape, I've never seen anyone run any amount of Aerogruts without also running at least one Swog Rider. And why wouldn't you? For just 25 points, a player gets a figure that buffs the attack and defense of every Aerogrut adjacent to it by 1. And like most Grut units in Heroscape, the Swog Rider also has Disengage, which pairs well with its extremely fast 8 move, the highest base move in the game. While the Swog Rider only has a single life and only average attack and defense of 3, I think it's already justified its modest price tag with its stat line, and ability to buff and bond with the Aerogruts. What's more, as a common hero, a player can draft multiple Swogs, whose buffs to their Aerogruts stack. This means that an Aerogrut adjacent to 2 Swog Riders will get its attack and defense raised to 3. If an Aerogrut somehow got adjacent to 3 Swogs, you'd have raised his attack to 4 at 6 range. This for a figure only worth 13 points. From this we can see the argument in favor of multiple Swogs start to emerge. Not only can these multiple Swogs stack their buffs onto Aerogruts, but having more Swogs in your army creates more hexes on the board where their buffs are active. Assuming a Swog isn't sitting on the edge of a map, as a double-spaced figure, their buff will affect the 8 spaces that surround it. 2 Swogs makes 16 hexes of buffing space possible, 3 Swogs makes 24, and so on. Spreading out your various Swogs across the board sets up different areas the arrows can develop into and bounce between to stay mobile while retaining their buffs. Or you can clump them all together in one large Aerogrut pod, where their buffs are layering over each other and onto their archers. I think it's also important to have multiple Swogs for the simple reason that each is only 1 life, 3 defense. They're easy to drop, especially from an opponent's range, and so the extra Swogs also provide much needed insurance against unlucky rolls or enemy ambushes. But having lots of Swogs, lots of Aerogruts, and at least one other significant beast hero presents a challenge for the player fielding such an army. Since the arrows can only bond with 1 beast hero per order marker, a player has to decide whether to spend that bonding developing a Swog Rider or another more powerful beast hero they've brought along. Of course, decision-making around which hero to bond with exists for any army that has multiple bonding heroes. But since Grut armies rely heavily on proximity with their support heroes to increase their otherwise poor output, I think they require especially sound judgment from a player on when to bond with which hero in their force. And of all the Grut builds, I think this is particularly true for the Aerogruts and their Swog captains. When looking at the Aerogruts' melee counterparts, the Blade and Heavy Gruts, we can see that all 4 official Orc champions these squads can bond with are unique, multi-life heroes. Of these 4, the 2 champions that require adjacency to provide their buffs, namely Grimneck and Tornak, are also both offensively inclined heroes that you will want to keep near your front line during a fight. Tornak has a respectable base attack of 4, and Grimneck has his Chomp ability, allowing him to kill any small or medium squad figure he's adjacent to before normal attacking. So while there are still important decisions to make in choosing whether to bond with Grimneck or Tornak on a turn, the more aggressive playstyle of these champions naturally pushes them into adjacency with their troops. And the other 2 Orc champions, Nerak and Ornak, while less suited for offense, provide aura buffs that extend a few spaces beyond their figures. So Blade and Heavy Grit armies that use them don't need to keep them as close to danger as they would Grimneck or Tornak. It's worth noting too that every one of these 4 champions has multiple lives and 3 or higher base defense, so they're much harder to kill in a single unlucky attack. The same can't be said for the Swog Riders and the decision-making a player faces when running them alongside other powerful beasts in an Arrowgrut army. Including the Swog Rider, there are currently 6 official beast heroes Arrowgrut's players can put into their armies. Age of Annihilation has introduced Kita the Spring Runner and Onshu the Welkanai, who, while serviceable as filler units for the arrows, are hardly essential. Besides the Swog Rider, the remaining 3 official beasts offer the starkest comparison to the Blade and Heavy Grut's bonding options. D&D Heroscape introduced the Ice Troll Berserker, the only uncommon beast the arrows can bond with, allowing multiple Ice Trolls to be present in a single army. At a modest 85 points, Ice Trolls can buff their move on d20 rolls, heal their own injuries through Cold Regenerate, and drop impressive base attacks of 5. But the most important of these beasts for the arrows are Krug and Me-Burq-Sa, 2 remarkably powerful figures that help the arrows in so many of their matchups. Setting aside the debate of which of these 2 is the overall better choice, you have in Krug a tremendously offensive melee unit that can kill virtually anything he engages. And in Me-Burq-Sa, you have a nimble flying unit with a spectacularly long-range special attack that can injure or kill multiple figures in its massive straight-line area of effect. With these strengths, there are major incentives to bonding with either Krug or Me-Burq-Sa on a turn, and every turn you bond with either of them, you're giving up bonding with a Swog Rider. A player is then faced with 2 different jobs they need to accomplish over the course of a battle: activating Krug and or Me-Burq-Sa to distribute as much damage as they can, and activating Swog Riders to set up support positions with their Arrowgruts. And these 2 jobs can't be done simultaneously in one order marker. In the Blade and Heavy Gruts example, your 2 jobs are also to set up your support heroes adjacent to your troops, and make sure your offensive heroes are doing their damage. But Grimneck and Tornak are both offensive and support heroes, so bonding with them often accomplishes both tasks in one turn. Not so with Krug, Me-Burq-Sa, and the Swogs, leading to some critical calls a player has to make during a battle. This is further complicated by the fact that Arrowgrut armies, like most Grut builds, tend to have massive numbers of figures on the board, sometimes enough to completely fill a 24-hex start zone. That means several turns will be needed to shuttle out all those figures and get them into strong positions on a map. Fortunately, since the arrows are ranged figures, they don't need to advance too far onto a board to begin threatening the opponent's side. And with their 8 move, Swogs that haven't been moved from your start zone can often reach Arrowgruts out in the field in a single turn. This is helpful given that Swogs have a single life and can die in a single attack, so if one is destroyed, another can quickly rush up to replace them on your next turn. It can also be useful to sacrifice a Swog by sending it out beyond an Arrowgrut's camp to intercept and slow down any dangerous figures approaching your positions. If that danger unit chooses to stay put and deal with the Swog, then whether or not that Swog survives, you can bond with another Swog on your next turn, fill in the spot near the Arrowgruts the previous Swog abandoned, then fire into the danger figure with hopefully a full squad of buffed Arrowgruts. Swogs also have some uses beyond the Arrowgruts builds they usually find themselves in. Given how cheap they are to draft, they can be a serviceable filler unit for any army that has 25 to 30 points left to spend. And independent of any army, Swogs can be half-decent early-game glyph grabbers with their excellent move. While they're not great at holding those glyphs, you may be able to position a Swog in your start zone so that they can reach a glyph in one turn. When an opening presents itself, you can fire the Swog out and claim the glyph before the opponent. Even if the Swog only holds that glyph for one turn, delaying the opponent from obtaining the glyph, even for one turn, to say nothing of the glyph's effects for your army, can sometimes justify those 25 points spent on the Swog just through that kind of play. In addition, the Swogs actually bond with one other Orc squad in official Heroscape, those being the very strong Death Chasers of Thesk. Since the Chasers aren't an Archer-class Orc squad, they won't receive any of the Swog's buffs, and their roster of Taskmaster heroes are so strong that you should usually be drafting Me-Burq-Sa, Nerak, and an Ogre or 2 before even thinking about adding in a generic Swog Rider. But again, if you're building a Chaser army and have only 25 to 30 points left to spare, throwing in a Swog Rider for one extra bonding hero strikes me as a good choice. Despite the bonding challenges they pose, Swog Riders are a critical part of why Arrowgrut armies remain well regarded to this day. They're cheap, provide essential support to their archers, and can fulfill glyph grabbing and interceptor roles reasonably well for their points. It's hard to fault anything about them for only 25 points in Classic, and so I have them at B tier on this list. They don't always define the games they're in, but they easily earn their points through their contributions. Concluding on a personal note, the Aerogrut's Swog Rider build is actually one I tend to stay away from. Frankly, I find it intimidating, not just to play against, but to play with. It really is an enormous amount of different moving parts to keep track of, and every time I've played it, I've never felt I was managing all my figures as efficiently as I could have been. The positions I set up with my arrows and swags always felt underdeveloped because I spent so many other turns bonding with Krug or mimring for their amazing damage potentials, and I rarely felt sure of my timing with any of those bonding moves besides. The forethought that this army requires in how you position your figures and leave open hexes for the next wave of arrows or swags to fill in on future turns is both impressive and overwhelming to me, but I think that's part of the success of the Swog Rider's design. Aerogrut armies require a lot of practice and skill to get right, which I won't say about 4th Mass armies. You need to think several turns in advance to maximize your development while also exercising wisdom and knowing which heroes to bond with at every step of a battle. And for those who have mastered that complexity, it's an army that performs very well. That's not just the hallmark of well-designed units, but the hallmark of a well-designed build. And the Swog Riders are ingredient in that. They're yet another icon in an already iconic wave, and have rightfully earned an enduring place in competitive Heroscape. Nice boast for a 25-point hero. Finally, we come to the community rankings for the Swog Rider, and these are the rankings I'm most curious about out of all units in Utgar's Rage. The Swag is held in fairly high regard without VC units, ranked B+ in Classic and Delta formats.
Hey everyone, it's Editor Doggin again. I'm going to have a couple updates for this one because Swog Rider has changed quite a bit since I recorded it, but right now, in standard points and delta points, without factoring in VC, he's actually increased to A- ranking, so he's up from B+ to A-, so people think he's getting better. So that's his ranking, and we'll come to his points adjustments later.
It's when you bring those VC units in that he drops to C+ in VC Classic and VC Delta, and I'd like to know why. I can't think of any unit in VC that specifically reduces the Swog's effectiveness, but this could be a ripple effect from changing opinions on the Aerogruts themselves. Again, it's not a build I play very often, but I don't dispute the rankings. Price-wise, Delta and VC Delta discount the Swog Rider by 10 points for a final price of 15 per Swog.
Editor Doggin again. So the Swog Rider's Delta price has gone up since the time I recorded this little section. So at the time that I recorded it, he was at 15 points. He is now up to 20 points. So that's still a discount from his original 25 points in Classic, but it seems opinions of the Swog are going up, and he's being priced accordingly.
That strikes me as a pretty good deal for what he brings to the table. I'm not sure it'll get me to play the army more, but I do like seeing it.
Okay, and as per tradition, we will go over all of the units in this wave, put all of their rankings up on screen right now so we can get a broad overview of the competitive strength of this wave, its impact, and just get a sense of how well all of the units at a glance have fared since the release of this wave. And right off the bat, we can see 4 A-rank units. So we have 4th Massachusetts Line, Knights of Weston, a range and melee squad respectively, both A. That was an easy ranking. Those are just outstanding units altogether. And then we have 2 A-rank heroes. Now, I know that Krug some people might quarrel with my A rank on Krug, but frankly, I just love him too much. And that's the thing too. One of the hidden ingredients in my own personal tier list ranking is vibes. Vibes are a very important factor. So if the vibes are strong for a unit, they get a little advantage in the tier rankings. That's just the way it is. So Krug, maybe he's more of a B rank in competitive play, but he's just too near and dear in my heart, so I have to average it out at A. He's S in my heart, but we're going to put him at A just to kind of walk that line. So yeah, and I also think too that there are good things about Krug. I think he is a tremendously powerful hero, and he hits so hard. It's just I think the A you can even argue the A just on his mechanics alone. So but certainly Me-Burq-Sa, no question, is an A unit. I think I will stand by what I said, that Me-Burq-Sa is the strongest unit in this wave, especially at his classic points for 50. It is absurd what he brings to the table for only 50 points. And then even with the new Renegade pricing of 70, and even with the 85 point increase that he has in Delta, just still a very outstanding outstanding unit, just really great. So I am totally content with leaving him as the best unit in my pick for the best unit in this wave. And then after that, we still have 3 B rank units, so still very good. Marro Drones, I really like them. I think they can do well. They're inconsistent, sure, but if you know how to play around that, I still think they're pretty effective. Minions of Utgar have great stats, and they just hit so hard. Plus, we have all the new Age of Annihilation Kyrie to play with, so I think there's more. I still think there's more to discover with the minions. So, very good unit there. And then the Swog Rider, B. And as I shared earlier, it seems like the community's opinions of the Swog Rider are steadily going up. So it's a critical component of a very good build, the Arrogret Swog Rider build, the Beast build, and the Swog is great. So yeah, very good unit there as well. And then we get to 2 C rank units, the Anubian Wolves. I love them dearly, but they are just very inconsistent, and it's really rough when they don't charge up to attack when you need them to. So there are ways to play around it, as I hope I've shown, but they struggle. So they're a ton of fun, but they struggle a lot. Then we have Sir Denrick. Pretty inoffensive unit. It's just that he's outclassed by a lot of his peers, and as we've seen with the Delta pricing, it seems opinion of him is going down. So 65 points, that seems like a good price for him, good deal for what Denrick brings. But on this list, we have him at C. And then after that, we get to Khosumet the Darklord, and unfortunately, as much as I enjoy the Anubians and as much as I like the sight of a thematic army with Khosumet in it, he's my pick for the worst unit in this wave, and I suspect many would agree. Just too expensive. He's too expensive and does too little for that price. He really just feels like a band-aid for Unleashed Fury. So a very expensive one, a premium band-aid at that. So I love Khosumet just as a character and as a sculpt and just as a figure in the canon. But it's hard to justify any higher than D. But still, even with Khosumet, this was just a really outstanding wave. Lots of very strong, very culturally and competitively relevant units. What a wave. What a wave.
And with that, folks, we conclude our discussion of the units of Wave 2 of Classic Heroscape. And what a delightfully nostalgic and game-defining expansion wave it was. I can still remember picking up sealed sets of Utgar's Rage off toy store shelves when I was a kid. The same can be said of the next wave I plan to cover in this series, which breaks the mold somewhat, since it's not a standard expansion wave, and is instead composed of a large figure expansion plus terrain expansions. Those of you familiar with Heroscape's history probably know which units I'm referring to, but I'll save those for when the next video is ready. On that note, I do feel I owe you all an explanation for why this video took so long to get to you. There's no single cause of the delay, but the biggest is the simple fact that these videos do take a very long time to make. I take the writing of these pieces pretty seriously, maybe too seriously, in part because I know people use them for listening content. So I try to make these videos not only useful sources of information for anyone looking to explore Heroscape more deeply, but also give them scripts that flow well and are easy on the ears. The other part of it is that work, family, and general life often pull me away from my hobby projects. In fact, this channel and my Heroscape love is only one of a few different hobbies I have, and Dog and Days is one of several creative projects I run in my spare time, so I try to make time for all of it. Know that I've got a lot more planned for this channel, and I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. Nor do I want to. The Heroscape community has been one of the most wholesome and welcoming hobby communities I've ever experienced, and I've met amazing people through it as a result. I doubt he's watching, but I do owe a very particular Heroscaper a big thanks for pointing me in the direction of the Heroscape group I now regularly play with. Before I ever started this channel, and before Heroscape's resurgence on YouTube, I, like many Heroscape fans, fell in love with the content of Sir Heroscape, especially his wonderful battle videos. One day I idly commented on one of his videos asking if he knew of a competitive scene in my area, and he promptly showed me where to go to find it, and I never properly thanked him for that. Finding and playing with my local group has been one of the most positive developments in my life these last few years, and so, Sir Heroscape, if you're watching, thank you for all you do, and for getting me started on my competitive Heroscape journey. I hope I can one day face you in person on the fields of Valhalla. On the note of Heroscape YouTube, ScapeTube? I've included on my channel page a list of other Heroscape channels that I follow and enjoy, and I encourage you all to check them out and subscribe if you like what you see. Regarding competitive Heroscape, if you're looking to get into a competitive scene in your area, I encourage you to check out heroscape.org to see if a group's near you. I never realized until the last few years that such a group existed in my area, and you may be surprised to find one already exists in yours. And if there's no group in your area, why not start your own? There are more Heroscapers out there than you might think, and maybe they too are waiting for someone to start a local scene. However you get into it, I promise you won't regret it. Well, that's all I've got for now. If you've made it this far, thank you all for watching. I've got lots more stuff planned for this channel in addition to our tier list videos, so stay tuned. Until we meet again, this has been Doggin Days. Take care everyone, stay safe, and scape on.